Welcome to the post-corporate transition district in Aldea Zamatulum. This isn't just a retreat, it's a realignment. District, a reorientation zone for high-agency individuals. Leverage our liminal architecture and dream validation framework.
Part 1: The Post-Corporate Transition District. The Condition of the World. May 24, 2026. Chapter 01: The Institutional Contract, Voided. Begin with the thing that is never said plainly, because the people whose interest it serves to leave it unsaid are precisely the people with the largest platforms and the most credentialed voices in every conversation about the future of work. The thing that is never said plainly is this: professional employment was never, at its core, an economic arrangement. It was an identity arrangement. The economic component, the salary, the benefits, the retirement contributions, the equity grants, the bonus structures was real, and its loss is real, and anyone who minimizes the material devastation of mass professional displacement in order to get to the philosophical point faster is being dishonest about the scale of what is happening to actual people in actual circumstances. The material loss is serious and it demands serious acknowledgment. But the material loss is not the deepest loss, and understanding why requires going back to the beginning of the arrangement and looking honestly at what it actually was. What the institutional contract offered, in exchange for your time and the sustained application of your capability, was not primarily money. Money was the mechanism. What it offered was a complete architecture for knowing who you were. Not in the existential sense that philosophy departments concern themselves with, but in the immediate, practical, moment-to-moment sense that governs the actual experience of being alive inside a social world. You knew, when you worked within an institution of sufficient size and legitimacy, where you stood relative to other people. You knew this through your title, which placed you on a legible hierarchy that others could read instantly and position themselves relative to without negotiation. You knew it through your compensation, which was calibrated against internal bands that were themselves calibrated against external markets, producing a number that felt objective in a way that no freelance invoice ever quite manages to feel. You knew it through your performance reviews, which were exercises in having your value assessed by someone authorized to assess it, someone whose assessment, precisely because it came from within the institutional structure, felt more real than the assessments of peers, friends, or your own self-evaluation. You knew it through your office, your badge, your email signature, your company's name on your LinkedIn headline, your response to the question, "What do you do?" At every social occasion where that question is the primary instrument of social location. The institution did not merely employ you, positioned you. It gave you a place in the world that the world recognized, that the world responded to, that the world used to know how to treat you. That is not a minor benefit. That is the central product. The economist would call this a non-wage benefit and move on. The sociologist would call it status and build a theoretical framework around its distribution. The psychologist would call it identity coherence and study its relationship to well-being. None of these framings is wrong, but none of them captures the operational significance of the thing for the person living inside it, which is simply this: knowing who you are in the social sense is not a luxury. It is the precondition for effective action in the world. Human beings who do not know how they are positioned, who cannot answer the implicit question, "What are you?" that every new social encounter asks, are not merely uncomfortable. They are operationally impaired. They cannot deploy their capabilities effectively because effective deployment requires confidence, and confidence in a social animal requires a stable social location. The institutional contract provided that location. Reliably, at scale, for the majority of the professional workforce of the developed world, for approximately 70 years. That is a long time. Long enough for the provision to feel natural. Long enough for the architecture to feel like the landscape rather than a structure built on the landscape that can be dismantled. long enough for 2 or 3 generations to reach adulthood without ever having developed the capacity to produce their own social coordinates independent of institutional affiliation, because they never had to. This is the inheritance of the post-war settlement. The great corporations, the government agencies, the universities, the professional partnerships, the consulting firms, the media organizations, the financial institutions, all of them, in their different registers and with their different cultures, were offering variations on the same fundamental product. They were offering membership in an institution that the surrounding society recognized as legitimate, and through that membership they were offering the social legibility that allows a person to function as a coherent self inside a world organized around institutions. The exchange seemed mutual. You gave time, capability, and a significant portion of your waking life. They gave money, yes, but more importantly they gave you a place to stand. For a long time, long enough to seem permanent, which is to say long enough to seem like the natural order of things rather than a historical contingency. This seemed like a reasonable deal. The people on both sides of the transaction had every incentive to believe it was a reasonable deal, and no particular reason to examine the assumptions buried inside it, which included the assumption that the institution would remain capable of making good on its end of the exchange indefinitely. It is no longer capable of doing so. The reasons for this are multiple and their interaction is complex, but the primary driver of the present moment of dissolution is not, as the first decade of automation anxiety suggested, the displacement of routine physical or clerical labor by machines. That displacement happened and will continue to happen, but it is not the historically novel event. The historically novel event, the one that changes the nature of the institutional contract at its foundation rather than at its edges, is the displacement of the class of cognitive, creative, communicative, and analytical labor that the professional managerial class had organized its entire identity around being uniquely capable of performing. This is the class that was told, with the full weight of institutional and educational authority behind the claim, that the coming wave of automation would spare them. Their jobs required judgment. Their jobs required creativity. Their jobs required the kind of contextual sensitivity and interpersonal nuance that machines would not, for the foreseeable future, be able to replicate. This claim was made in good faith by people who were reasoning correctly from the evidence available to them at the time. It turned out to be wrong at the level of the technology's trajectory, and it turned out to be wrong at exactly the moment when the people who had organized their lives around its truth had the least capacity to absorb the correction. Artificial intelligence, in its large language model instantiation, does not displace routine cognitive labor. It displaces sophisticated cognitive labor, and it does so with a fluency and at a marginal cost that makes the economic logic of maintaining large professional workforces inside institutional structures not merely questionable but increasingly indefensible in the language of fiduciary responsibility that governs how institutions justify their decisions to the people who own them. A language model that can produce a first draft of acceptable quality in seconds, that can synthesize research across thousands of documents in minutes, that can generate code without engineers, visual content without designers, strategic analysis without consultants, does not merely change the productivity calculus of hiring. It changes the institutional math of why to hire at scale at all. And when the institutional math changes at that level of fundamentality, the contract changes with it, not through renegotiation, which implies a conversation between parties with roughly equivalent leverage, but through voiding, which is what happens when one party to an exchange simply loses the structural capacity to deliver the product the other party thought they were buying. The word voided is chosen deliberately, and it is worth pausing on. A voided contract is not a broken contract, which implies that the breaking party had an obligation and failed it. A voided contract is one that has ceased to have legal force because a material condition on which it depended no longer exists. The condition on which the institutional contract depended on the institution side of the exchange was that the professional's cognitive capability was scarce enough relative to the institution's need for it that the institution had an ongoing structural reason to employ that professional and provide, in exchange, the identity scaffolding that was the deal's deepest product. When that scarcity dissolves, when the capability becomes available at comparable or superior quality, from a system that operates at a fraction of the cost and requires none of the identity maintenance that human employees require, the institution's structural reason for the exchange disappears. Not their ethical obligation, perhaps. Not their reputational interest in handling the transition gracefully. But the structural reason, the reason the exchange made sense in the first place, is gone. And institutions, being rational actors optimizing for their survival in competitive environments, follow the structural logic. They always have. This is not a moral failure of any particular institution. It is the behavior of a form of organization operating according to its own internal logic in conditions that have changed irreversibly. What makes this moment categorically different from previous waves of technological displacement, from the mechanization of agriculture, from the industrialization of manufacturing, from the computerization of clerical work, is the speed at which the relevant capabilities are being surpassed and the depth of the identity investment that the displaced class has made in those capabilities being the permanent foundation of their social value. The agricultural laborer displaced by mechanization had not, in most cases, constructed their entire social identity around the proposition that their manual labor was permanently irreplaceable. The factory worker displaced by automation had not organized their psychological architecture around the claim that their physical capability was the one thing no machine would ever match. But the professional, the consultant, the analyst, the strategist, the writer, the designer, the engineer, the researcher, the lawyer, the educator has done exactly this. They have spent years, often a decade or more, acquiring the credentials that certified their cognitive capabilities as valuable. They have organized their social identity around the institutional positions that validated those credentials in the eyes of the surrounding world. They have made life decisions, geographic, financial, relational, temporal, on the assumption that the value of those capabilities was durable. And they are now being told, in the impersonal language of restructuring announcements and product launches and labor market reports, that the assumption was wrong. There is no orderly transition available from this. Orderly transitions exist when the pace of change allows institutions and individuals to adapt sequentially, when the old skills become less valuable gradually enough that the educational system can retrain the workforce, when the new capabilities become more valuable slowly enough that the market can produce and credential the people who possess them before the old workforce has been fully displaced, when the social identity structures can be rebuilt incrementally rather than having to be constructed from scratch at middle age by people who never expected to need to build them. None of these conditions currently obtain. The pace of capability advancement in artificial intelligence has decoupled from the pace at which human institutions can adapt to it. This is not a temporary condition of transition lag that will correct itself when the technology matures. It is a structural condition produced by the compounding nature of the advancement itself, which means that by the time institutions have adapted to the current level of capability, the capability will be at a level that requires another round of adaptation. The adaptation cycle has become shorter than the institutional memory required to complete an adaptation cycle. This is a new condition in human economic history, and it deserves to be named as such rather than processed through the vocabulary of previous technological transitions that it superficially resembles but fundamentally differs from. The professionals arriving at a transition district are arriving from inside this condition. They are not, in the main, people who lacked the foresight to see what was coming. Many of them saw it clearly earlier than most, and it was precisely their clarity about the trajectory that made their institutional positions increasingly untenable before the positions were formally eliminated. They are not people who failed to adapt. Many of them have been adapting continuously, acquiring new skills, building new capabilities, repositioning themselves within their industries, doing everything that the vocabulary of career resilience instructed them to do. They are people for whom the adaptation infrastructure has collapsed faster than the adaptation can be completed. They are people whose capability is intact and whose context for deploying it has dissolved. They carry, in most cases, a combination of sophisticated skills, genuine ambition, accumulated knowledge, financial runway of varying duration, and a social identity that has been severed from its institutional moorings without warning and without the provision of any alternative architecture for knowing who they are and where they stand. That is the person the transition district is built to receive. Not the burned-out escapist who wants a beautiful place to stop thinking. Not the spiritual tourist who wants to feel different for 2 weeks before returning to the life they cannot bring themselves to change. Not the entrepreneur in retreat who needs a Wi-Fi connection and a reasonable espresso while they execute a plan they have already fully formed. The person this district is built for is the one who arrives with full capability and no operating context, with a powerful engine and no road, with the ambition to build something real and the disorientation of having lost, through no failure of their own, the entire external architecture that previously told them what real looked like and whether they were achieving it. That person is not a demographic niche. As of this writing, they are forming into the largest cohort of high-agency displaced people that the professional world has produced since the Second World War. And they are going somewhere. The question this handbook is written to answer is whether Aldea Zama will be ready when they arrive, and whether it will have established, before their arrival, the governing vocabulary and the operational infrastructure that converts their displacement into the founding capital of the civilization that comes after the one that displaced them. Part 1. The condition of the WORLD Chapter 02, the solvent and the scaffold. The vocabulary available for describing what artificial intelligence is doing to the professional world is almost uniformly inadequate, and its inadequacy is not accidental. The dominant metaphors disruption, transformation, automation, displacement are borrowed from previous technological transitions and carry, embedded in their grammar, the assumption that what is happening now belongs to the same category of event as what happened before. That assumption is incorrect, and the incorrectness matters enormously for anyone trying to understand not just what is being lost in the current transition but what kind of response the loss requires. A misdiagnosis of the nature of the event produces a misdiagnosis of the nature of the remedy, and the history of institutional responses to technological transition is littered with remedies designed for the wrong event. Retraining programs built for a disruption that turned out to be a dissolution, adaptation frameworks built for a transition that turned out to be a replacement, resilience curricula built for a turbulence that turned out to be a restructuring at the level of the substrate, rather than the surface. The distinction this chapter is concerned with establishing is the distinction between a tool and a solvent. A tool augments capability. It extends the reach of human capacity in specific, bounded, and ultimately subordinate ways. The hammer augments the arm. The calculator augments arithmetic. The word processor augments writing in its mechanical dimensions, the speed of composition, the ease of revision, the storage and retrieval of text, while leaving the writer in the position of the agent whose judgment and capability determine the value of the output. A tool, however powerful, operates within a relationship of instrumentality. The human wields it, the tool executes, and the human's judgment remains the scarce and therefore valuable input in the overall system of production. The economic logic of tooling is that it makes the capable human more productive, which tends to increase the economic value of the human's capability over time because the output of that capability, amplified by the tool, becomes more valuable in the market. This is the history of most technological progress. Tools make capable people more productive, and the market rewards the increased productivity in ways that broadly, if unevenly, distribute economic benefit across the population of people whose work involves those tools. This is why economists trained on the history of technological progress have tended to respond to warnings about automation with relative equanimity. They have seen the pattern many times. The tool arrives, disrupts the existing labor arrangements, produces transitional unemployment and transitional anxiety, and then the equilibrium restores itself at a higher level of productivity and, eventually, a broader distribution of economic participation. The pattern is real and its historical record is genuine. It just does not describe what is happening now. A solvent does not augment the capability of the human within a system. It dissolves the substrate on which the system depends. When you introduce a solvent into a structure, you do not make the structure work differently or work better or work at higher volume. You make the structure cease to cohere. The components that held together because the substrate bound them to each other begin to separate. The relationships that were stable because the substrate provided a medium for their stability become unstable. The outputs that the structure was producing stop being produced, not because the inputs have changed but because the organizational logic that converted inputs into outputs has been chemically compromised. A solvent does not compete with the structure at the task level. It operates at the level of the medium that made the structure possible. This is why the effects of a solvent are so much harder to diagnose in real time than the effects of a tool. The tool's impact is visible at the surface, in changed outputs and altered workflows and measurable productivity differentials. The solvent's impact is initially invisible at the surface, because the surface is still structurally intact, while the substrate beneath it is being dissolved, and the full consequence of the dissolution only becomes apparent when the structure that was resting on the substrate begins to collapse in ways that appear sudden to observers who were not watching the substrate. Large language models, and the broader ecosystem of artificial intelligence capabilities that they are both the most visible product of and the organizing metaphor for, are functioning as a solvent applied to the substrate of the knowledge economy. The substrate of the knowledge economy is not any specific task or any specific set of skills. The substrate of the knowledge economy is the scarcity of sophisticated cognitive capability. The fact that the ability to read, synthesize, analyze, write, design, strategize, code, reason, communicate, and produce at a high level of quality has, for the entirety of the modern economic era, been a scarce input whose scarcity the market has priced generously. That scarcity is the substrate. The entire structure of the knowledge economy, its compensation levels, its credential systems, its institutional hierarchies, its professional licensing frameworks, its educational pipelines, its identity architectures, its social prestige distributions rests on that substrate. When the substrate dissolves, the structure does not transform. Collapses. Not immediately, not uniformly, not at the same pace in every sector or every geography or every specific domain of practice, but in the direction of collapse, not transformation. And the direction is the thing that matters for anyone trying to understand what is happening and what it requires. The solvent metaphor is also useful because it captures something that the disruption metaphor systematically obscures: the relationship between the rate of dissolution and the capacity for response. When a tool disrupts a labor market, the disruption happens at a pace that is bounded by the pace of the tool's adoption, which is itself bounded by the pace of capital investment, infrastructure development, workforce retraining, and institutional adaptation. These are slow processes. They produce transitional suffering, but they also produce transitional time in which the affected workforce can observe the direction of the change, update their understanding of what capabilities will remain valuable, acquire those capabilities through educational and retraining pathways, and reposition themselves in the labor market before the disruption has completed its full course. The history of tooling-based technological transitions is a history of disruption producing adaptation lag, and the adaptation lag producing a period of transitional unemployment and anxiety, followed by a period of adaptation completion and restabilization at a new equilibrium. The key variable is the length of the adaptation lag relative to the depth of the disruption. When the lag is short relative to the disruption, the transition is managed. When the lag is long relative to the disruption, the transition is experienced as crisis. But in both cases, the transition has a completion, a point at which the new equilibrium has been established and the structural relationship between human capability and economic value has been restabilized on the basis of the new technological conditions. The solvent works differently. The solvent's rate of action is not bounded by adoption pace in the same way, because the solvent is not a tool being installed in a production system. It is a capability being offered via cloud infrastructure at essentially zero marginal cost to anyone with an internet connection and a browser. The adoption curve of a tool is limited by the capital required to acquire and deploy it. The adoption curve of a solvent is limited only by the speed of awareness and the threshold of cognitive acceptance of what the awareness implies. More consequentially, the solvent's rate of action is not fixed. A tool has a defined capability profile at the moment of its deployment. The hammer drives nails with a certain force, the word processor edits text at a certain speed, the calculator performs arithmetic at a certain accuracy level, and that capability profile does not significantly change over the tool's useful life. The solvent is improving at a compounding rate. The capability that dissolved the first layer of the substrate is being superseded, on a timeline of months rather than years, by a more capable version of itself that dissolves the next layer. This produces a condition that has no precedent in the history of tool-based technological transitions. The adaptation lag is longer than the improvement cycle. By the time the professional workforce has adapted to the level of AI capability that displaced the first wave of cognitive labor, the capability has advanced to a level that requires another round of adaptation. The adaptation is perpetually behind the dissolution. There is no equilibrium toward which the system is tending, because the solvent is not approaching a fixed maximum capability level. It is compounding, and the compound interest of dissolution is not recovery. It is structural collapse at an accelerating rate of completion. This brings the argument to the scaffold, which is the second element of this chapter's central metaphor, and the one that most directly explains what the transition district is designed to address. A scaffold is a temporary external structure erected to support a building during construction or renovation, to hold up the elements of the building that cannot yet support themselves while the permanent structure that will eventually bear their weight is being built. The scaffold is not the building. The scaffold is what makes the building possible before the building is capable of standing on its own. When the building is complete, the scaffold is removed, and the building stands on its own structural logic, supported by the relationships between its own elements rather than by the external temporary structure that held it upright during the period of its formation. The scaffold's removal, when the building is complete, is not a loss. It is the completion of the construction process. The building was always going to have to stand on its own eventually. The scaffold was always going to have to come down. The institutional framework of professional employment has functioned, for the class of people this handbook is primarily concerned with, as a scaffold. It held up the professional self during the period, a period that turned out to last an entire career rather than a transitional phase, when the professional self had not developed the internal structural logic required to support itself independent of external institutional affiliation. It provided the external social coordinates, the legitimizing hierarchy, the performance validation, the purpose assignment, the community, the daily structure, the forward narrative of promotion and advancement, and the accumulation of institutional recognition, all of which are the functional equivalents of the scaffold's crossbeams and support poles, the temporary external elements that hold up the structure until the structure can hold itself up. The scaffold, in this metaphor, was never meant to be permanent. The professional self was always meant, eventually, to develop the internal structural logic that would allow the scaffold to be removed without the self collapsing. But the scaffold turned out to be so convenient, so well-maintained, so culturally normalized, and so thoroughly integrated into the social logic of a professional life that the development of the internal structure, the sovereign capability to generate one's own social coordinates, purpose architecture, performance feedback, community, and forward narrative independent of institutional provision, was systematically deferred. Not because the professionals who deferred it were weak or unimaginative or insufficiently ambitious, but because the scaffold was working, and working systems do not generate the urgency required for the difficult and disorienting work of building the permanent structure that will eventually replace them. The solvent has removed the scaffold. Not at the pace at which a construction crew removes a completed scaffold, deliberately, safely, with the building already standing and the construction crew already prepared for what removal will require. The solvent has dissolved the scaffold's structural connections, and the scaffold is now coming apart at a pace and in an order determined by the chemistry of the dissolution rather than the logic of the construction. The professional self that was leaning on the scaffold is now discovering, at the moment of the scaffold's dissolution, that the internal structure was not fully built, and that the internal structure that was built was designed around the scaffold's presence rather than its absence, which means that some of what was built will need to be rebuilt, because it was built in a way that requires the external support that is no longer there. This is a more complex and more costly renovation than starting from scratch, because starting from scratch at least allows the builder to design for the permanent conditions from the beginning. Retrofitting a structure that was built for scaffold dependence into a structure capable of standing on its own requires identifying and removing the load-bearing elements that depended on the scaffold, replacing them with load-bearing elements that do not, and doing all of this while the building remains occupied by a self that has not stopped having needs, producing output, and navigating the world simply because the scaffold came down unexpectedly. The transition district is the site where this renovation happens, under the best conditions that can be provided for a renovation that was not planned and cannot be delayed. It is not the only possible site. It is not magic. It does not solve the problem by the fact of its existence. It solves the problem by providing, in physical and cultural and operational form, the specific conditions under which the renovation of a scaffold-dependent professional self into a self capable of generating its own coordinates, what this handbook calls operational sovereignty, can proceed with the highest possible probability of completion and the lowest possible probability of the two most common failure modes: the retreat to a new scaffold, which produces temporary stability and eventual repetition of the same crisis, and the collapse into purposelessness, which produces the kind of prolonged disorientation that becomes indistinguishable, in its external presentation, from the withdrawal that follows any profound and unprocessed loss. The people for whom this district is built have arrived at the moment of the scaffold's removal with, in almost every case, more internal structural capacity than they know. The institutional scaffold did not merely hold them up, it also, incidentally and without intending to, provided the conditions under which they developed capabilities that were not formally recognized by the institutional credential system but that are, for the purposes of building a sovereign operating life, more valuable than the credentials themselves. What the transition district provides is the container in which those capabilities can be redirected toward the construction of the permanent structure, supported by a community of people who are doing the same thing, guided by practitioners who have already done it, and anchored in a physical territory whose specific atmospheric and spatial conditions are, as this handbook argues at length, unusually well suited to the nature and the demands of the renovation. This is not an optimistic argument in the sense of an argument that minimizes the cost or the difficulty of what the dissolution has produced. The cost is real. The difficulty is real. The dissolution of the scaffold has done genuine damage to a large number of genuinely capable people, and the damage is not remedied by pointing out that the scaffold was always temporary or that the internal structure is more intact than it appears. But the argument is realistic in a way that the available alternatives are not. The realistic alternative to building the permanent structure is the search for a new scaffold, the attempt to find a new institution, a new employer, a new organizational context that will restore the external provision of social coordinates and purpose architecture and performance validation that the old institution provided. This search is understandable. It is familiar. It follows the logic of the only operating system the professional has been trained on. And it will, for a significant portion of the people who pursue it, result in temporary success. A new position, a new title, a new salary, a new organizational identity, followed by the same dissolution on a shorter timeline, because the conditions producing the dissolution are not specific to any particular institution or any particular industry. They are structural and they are accelerating. The new scaffold will be dissolved by the same solvent that dissolved the old one, and the renovation deferred will be a renovation that has to be undertaken under worse conditions with less runway, and after the additional psychological cost of having believed, again, that the scaffold was stable. The transition district is the argument for doing the renovation now, under the best available conditions, with the resources and the runway and the psychological readiness that the present moment makes possible, before the runway shortens, before the resources deplete, and before the repeated dissolution of successive scaffolds has produced a level of demoralization that makes the renovation feel not just difficult but futile. The argument is not that this is easy. It is that it is necessary, that the conditions for doing it are better now than they will be later, that the physical territory of Aldea Zama provides unusual advantages as the site for doing it, and that the community of people currently arriving at this geography in this precise moment of civilizational transition constitutes a founding cohort of unusual density, capability, and complementarity whose convergence is not guaranteed to recur on any predictable timeline. The solvent is at work. The scaffold is coming down. The only available response to that fact, the only response that does not end, eventually, in the repetition of the same crisis under worse conditions, is the construction of the permanent structure. That construction is what this handbook is about. Part 1. The condition of the WORLD Chapter 03, Identity without Architecture. There is a condition that has no adequate name in the existing vocabulary of psychological distress, professional transition, or personal crisis, and its namelessness is one of the primary reasons it is so consistently misdiagnosed, by the people experiencing it, by the people around them, and by the institutional and therapeutic systems designed to respond to it. The condition is not depression, though it shares depression's characteristic of making the future feel structureless and gray. It is not burnout, though it shares burnout's characteristic of having arrived through a sustained period of high output and institutional demand. It is not grief, though it shares grief's characteristic of having been produced by the loss of something that was real and that genuinely mattered. It is not an identity crisis in the adolescent sense, the provisional, exploratory, developmental disorientation of a self that has not yet assembled its working theory of who it is, because the people experiencing it have already assembled that theory, have tested it against years of institutional experience, and have arrived at a stable and functional sense of professional selfhood that served them adequately for a significant portion of their adult lives. What they are experiencing is not the absence of an identity. It is the sudden and involuntary absence of the external architecture that gave their identity its structural coherence in a social world that depends on externally legible categories to make sense of the people inside it. The distinction between an identity and an identity architecture is the conceptual foundation of this entire chapter, and it is worth establishing with care before the argument proceeds, because the failure to make the distinction clearly is what produces the most common and most damaging error in the design of responses to post-institutional displacement. The error is to treat the displaced professional as someone who does not know who they are, and to design a response, whether therapeutic, educational, communal, or programmatic, around the project of helping them discover or construct a self. This is the logic of the retreat industry, the life coaching complex, the personal development ecosystem, and a significant portion of the intentional community landscape. It is a misdiagnosis that produces responses which are at best irrelevant to the actual condition and at worst actively harmful, because they direct the displaced person's energy and attention toward the wrong level of the problem. The displaced professional, in almost every case, knows exactly who they are in the deep sense. They have values, preferences, capabilities, aesthetic sensibilities, intellectual commitments, and a working theory of what kind of life is worth living that is entirely intact and often more clearly articulated than before the displacement, precisely because the displacement forced a degree of self-examination that institutional life never required. What they lack is not a self. What they lack is a social architecture through which the self can be legibly presented to the world and recognized by the world in ways that make effective action in the world possible. To understand why the architecture matters as much as the identity it supports, it is necessary to think carefully about the specific functions that the institutional context was performing in the daily life of the professional who inhabited it, not the abstract functions that organizational theorists describe when they write about the role of institutions in social life, but the granular, immediate, moment-to-moment functions that governed the actual texture of working inside an institutional structure. These functions are less visible than the salary and the title because they operated in the background of professional life, like the operating system that runs beneath the visible applications on a computer screen, invisible when functioning correctly, catastrophically present when it stops. The first and most fundamental of these background functions was social legibility. Every social encounter in a professional life involves the implicit question of who the person is, and the institutional affiliation provided the answer to that question in a form that was universally readable without negotiation or explanation. When you met someone at a professional event and they asked what you did, the institutional answer, "I'm a senior director of product strategy at Morgan Stanley," or "I'm a partner at McKinsey," or "I run the editorial department at Condé Nast," conveyed in a single sentence an enormous amount of information that the receiving party could decode instantly and use to calibrate the social interaction that followed. The level of expertise to assume, the professional vocabulary to use, the relative status positions to observe, the potential areas of mutual interest or professional relevance to explore, the basic credibility to extend to subsequent claims the person might make about their experience or their capabilities. The institutional affiliation was not merely a label. It was a social decoding key that allowed the professional to enter new social environments with their position already established, their credibility already conferred, their relevance already assumed. Without it, every new social encounter requires a negotiation that the institutional affiliation previously made unnecessary, the negotiation of who you are, why you matter, why your perspective is worth attending to, what your relationship to the person across from you should be understood to be. This negotiation is not impossible. It is simply exhausting in a way that the institutionally affiliated professional has never had to be exhausted by it before, and its exhaustingness compounds in proportion to the frequency of new social encounters, which in a professional life oriented toward the building of new relationships and opportunities is very high. The second background function was temporal architecture. Institutional employment provided the professional's day, week, month, year, and career with a structure that was not chosen but inherited, and whose inherited quality was a significant part of its value. The meeting schedule determined when to be where. The project deadline determined the intensity and the direction of effort over a defined period. The quarterly review cycle marked the passage of time in a way that gave the professional a sense of forward movement. The quarter was completed, assessed, and succeeded by the next quarter, which brought a new set of objectives and a fresh opportunity to perform against them. The annual performance cycle was a more consequential version of the same structure, a moment of institutional assessment that gave the professional a measure of where they stood relative to their own previous performance and relative to the standards of the institution, followed by a recalibration of compensation and title that made the passage of the year feel consequential rather than merely chronic. The career arc itself, the progression from junior to senior, from individual contributor to manager, from manager to director, from director to executive, provided the professional's working life with a narrative structure that made each position feel like a chapter in a story moving toward something rather than a position being occupied without reference to what preceded it or what would follow. When the institutional affiliation ends, all of this temporal architecture disappears simultaneously. The day no longer has a structure that was decided before you arrived at it. The week no longer has a rhythm that was externally imposed. The month no longer accumulates toward a defined end. The year no longer has a moment of institutional assessment that tells you whether you are making progress or not. The career no longer has a narrative arc that allows you to locate your current position within a meaningful forward trajectory. What replaces these structures is not freedom, though it is often described and initially experienced as freedom. What replaces them is formlessness, the condition of a self that is capable of structuring its own time, but that has never had to develop that capability because the institution always performed the structuring function, and that now discovers, in the absence of the external structure, that self-structuring is a skill that requires deliberate cultivation rather than a capacity that emerges naturally in the absence of external constraint. The third background function was performance feedback. Institutional life provided the professional with a continuous, if imperfect, stream of information about whether what they were doing was good enough, and by whose standards and relative to what expectations. The feedback came in multiple registers simultaneously: the explicit feedback of performance reviews and managerial assessments, the implicit feedback of compensation decisions and promotion timelines and project assignments, the social feedback of peer recognition and organizational visibility and invitation to high-profile work, the market feedback of the institution's competitive position, and the department's budget and the project's outcomes relative to its objectives. None of this feedback was perfectly accurate, and much of it was distorted by politics, by bias, by the specific limitations of the managers and the metrics through which the assessment was conducted. But the distortions were known distortions. The professional had learned, over time, to read the institutional feedback system with the sophistication of a person who knows the instrument's quirks and can compensate for them. The distorted feedback of a known system is, in terms of navigational utility, vastly more useful than the absence of feedback from a system that has not yet been built. The post-institutional professional produces output, writes, designs, codes, consults, creates, analyzes, and receives in place of the institutional feedback system, a silence that is not silence but rather the absence of any calibrated external signal that would allow them to know whether the output is good, whether it is finding the people it is meant for, whether it is producing the effect it was designed to produce, whether it represents progress toward anything that can be defined with sufficient precision to make the concept of progress meaningful. The development of the internal feedback mechanisms that allow a sovereign operator to assess their own output without external institutional validation is one of the most difficult and most important aspects of the transition to post-institutional life, and it is the aspect that is most consistently underestimated by people who have not gone through it, because it looks from the outside like a simple matter of confidence. You just need to believe in your own work, when it is actually a complex matter of building new evaluative infrastructure in the absence of the external evaluative infrastructure that was always previously available. The fourth background function, and in some ways the most underestimated, was the provision of an incidental community. Institutional life placed the professional in daily proximity with a stable group of people: colleagues, collaborators, managers, reports, clients, whose presence was not contingent on the professional's active social effort. The community was inherited with the position. The professional did not choose most of the people around them. They did not have to recruit them, maintain the relationships through deliberate effort, or persuade them of the value of continued contact. The relationships existed because the institutional structure placed both parties in ongoing proximity and mutual dependency, and the ongoing proximity and mutual dependency generated, over time, the kind of familiarity and shared reference that constitutes a social world. A set of people who know your working style, your humor, your history, your particular way of approaching problems, your characteristic strengths and characteristic failures, and who respond to you accordingly. The loss of this community is one of the most practically significant and least publicly acknowledged dimensions of post-institutional displacement, because it is not the kind of loss that is culturally recognized as serious. The friends you make at work are supposed to remain your friends when the work ends. The professional relationships you built are supposed to transfer into your independent life and remain available to you as resources and as community. In practice, a significant portion of these relationships are revealed, by the cessation of the institutional structure that generated them, to have been maintained by the structure rather than by genuine mutual investment. Not because the people involved were not genuinely fond of each other, but because the maintenance of any relationship requires the investment of time and attention, and the institutional structure was providing the conditions for that investment automatically and costlessly in the form of shared physical space, shared projects, shared deadlines, and shared organizational objectives. When those conditions disappear, the relationships require active, deliberate maintenance that competes with all the other demands of the transition, and many of them do not survive the competition. The post-institutional professional discovers, often with a degree of shock that they did not anticipate, that the social world they inhabited was more institutional than personal, that the community was a product of the scaffold, and that the scaffold's removal has taken significant portions of the community with it. The fifth background function was the provision of purpose at the level of daily task. Institutional life assigned meaning to the professional's daily activity through the organizational objectives that framed it. The work you did mattered because the organization had determined that it mattered, had assigned resources and personnel to it, had defined outcomes against which its success would be assessed, and had integrated it into a larger organizational logic that connected it, however distantly, to something beyond the immediate task. The meaning of any individual piece of work within an institutional context is partly a product of the work itself and partly a product of the institutional frame that positions it within a consequential whole. The institutional frame does not create meaning from nothing. The work that was genuinely meaningless within the institution was experienced as meaningless regardless of the frame's best efforts. But it amplifies the meaning of work that has genuine content by situating it within a context of organizational stakes and collective effort that makes the individual contribution feel part of something larger than itself. When the institutional frame is removed, the professional discovers that the daily production of output, the writing, the designing, the coding, the analyzing, the strategizing, requires a different kind of meaning generation than the institutional frame was providing. The work now has to carry its own meaning, in its own terms, without reference to organizational objectives or collective effort or institutional stakes. This is possible. Many people build working lives of profound meaning entirely outside institutional frameworks. But it requires a capacity for autonomous meaning generation, the ability to identify what you care about independently of what the organization has decided it cares about, to connect your daily activity to that independently identified purpose, and to sustain that connection over time without the external reinforcement of organizational recognition and institutional reward, that the institutional context systematically suppressed by providing a ready-made meaning architecture that made the development of an autonomous one unnecessary. The resulting condition, the combination of these 5 simultaneous absences, each individually significant and collectively producing a disorientation that exceeds the sum of its parts, is what this handbook is calling identity without architecture. The self is intact. The capabilities are intact. The values, the ambitions, the aesthetic commitments, the intellectual investments are all intact. What is missing is the external structure through which all of these elements were organized into a coherent and socially legible presentation, the scaffolding of institutional affiliation that held the self in a recognizable shape and allowed the world to respond to it in ways that made effective action possible. Without that structure, the self is not destroyed, but it is disorganized. Its elements are present but no longer arranged in a configuration that is either internally coherent or externally legible. The professional who was, in the institutional context, a confident and effective operator, decisive, creative, communicative, productive, socially fluent, becomes, outside that context, hesitant, disorganized, socially uncertain, and frequently paralyzed at the level of basic decisions about how to structure time and what to prioritize and whether what they are producing is any good. They are not a different person. They are the same person in a radically different environment, and the difference in their performance is a function of the environment rather than of any change in their underlying capability. This is an important distinction, because the response the condition requires is environmental rather than therapeutic. You are not treating a damaged self. You are providing an environment in which an intact self can reorganize itself into a configuration appropriate to the conditions it will actually be operating in, rather than the conditions it was trained for and is no longer inhabiting. It is worth pausing on the question of why the existing vocabulary for this condition is so inadequate, because the inadequacy is not merely inconvenient. It actively produces wrong responses, and the wrong responses compound the damage. The word that the displaced professional is most likely to use for their own condition is burnout, because burnout is the culturally available vocabulary for a professional who has lost their relationship to their work and is operating with diminished energy and motivation. But burnout is a condition produced by too much institutional demand, by the sustained overextraction of professional capability within an institutional context that did not provide adequate recovery, recognition, or meaning relative to the demands it was making. The treatment for burnout is rest, reduced demand, and the restoration of the conditions under which the institutional relationship can be re-entered with renewed energy. The treatment for burnout is, in other words, a better version of the institutional context, a more sustainable version of the same exchange that produced the burnout. The treatment for identity without architecture is fundamentally different. It is not a better version of the institutional context. It is the construction of an entirely different operating system. Treating identity without architecture as burnout produces responses. Rest, reduced demand, recovery retreats, sabbaticals, that are pleasant and temporarily relieving but that return the professional, after the recovery period, to the same fundamental condition of having no architecture, only now with a depleted runway and the additional discouragement of having rested extensively without finding that the rest resolved the underlying problem. The word that the professional's social environment is most likely to use for their condition is opportunity, as in, this is a great opportunity for you to do something different. The opportunity framing is meant kindly, and it contains a kernel of genuine truth. The removal of the institutional constraint does open possibilities that were not previously available. But the opportunity framing is also profoundly unhelpful in its timing, because it locates the displaced professional in a condition of readiness. Ready to seize the opportunity, ready to launch the venture, ready to build the thing they always wanted to build, that does not correspond to their actual psychological condition, which is a condition of significant structural disorientation that must be addressed before the opportunity can be seized effectively. Telling someone experiencing identity without architecture that they are in a position of opportunity is like telling someone whose house has just burned down that they now have a wonderful chance to build something better. The statement is factually accurate and entirely useless as immediate guidance, because the immediate reality is the loss, not the opportunity, and the loss must be genuinely processed before the opportunity can be genuinely engaged with. The opportunity framing, applied prematurely and without acknowledgment of the genuine disorientation that precedes it, produces another of the common failure modes. The premature launch, the decision to immediately start the venture or the creative practice or the freelance career before the internal reorganization required to sustain any of these has been completed, resulting in an enterprise built on an unstable foundation that collapses under the first serious pressure and produces a level of discouragement disproportionate to the practical setback, because the collapse of the venture feels like the collapse of the self-concept that the venture was supposed to demonstrate the viability of. The word that the professional's internal experience is most likely to produce is laziness, as in, I should be building something but instead I'm staring at a blank document, which means I am lazy and this confirms the worst things I feared about myself. The laziness attribution is the most damaging of all the misdiagnoses because it directs the professional's coping energy inward, toward self-criticism and the intensification of productivity pressure, in response to a condition that is not a failure of motivation but a failure of the environmental conditions under which motivation operates. Motivation is not a purely internal resource that a person either has or lacks. It is a relational phenomenon. It arises in the interaction between an individual's capabilities and values and the environmental conditions that provide direction, feedback, stakes, and community. The institutional context provided all of these environmental conditions. The post-institutional context provides none of them by default, and in the absence of the environmental conditions, the motivation that was abundantly present within the institutional context simply has nowhere to land. It is not that the professional has become lazy. It is that the professional is a productive engine running in neutral because the transmission that connected the engine to the wheels, the institutional structure that connected capability to direction, effort to feedback, output to recognition, has been removed, and the engine cannot drive the vehicle forward regardless of how hard it is revved. Increasing the rev, demanding more productivity, imposing harder deadlines, intensifying self-criticism, does not solve the transmission problem. It just burns more fuel in neutral and accelerates the depletion of the psychological resources available for the actual work of rebuilding the transmission. The transition district addresses the condition of identity without architecture at exactly the level at which the condition operates, the level of the environment. It does not attempt to repair the self, which does not need repairing. It does not offer therapeutic processing of the loss, which is a necessary but not sufficient response. It does not offer motivational acceleration of the launch into the next phase, which is premature in the absence of the infrastructure that would make the next phase sustainable. It offers, instead, a replacement architecture, temporary, transitional, explicitly designed to be outgrown, that provides the displaced professional with the social legibility, the temporal structure, the performance feedback, the incidental community, and the daily purpose that the institutional context previously provided, while simultaneously providing the conditions under which the professional can develop the autonomous capacity to generate all of these things for themselves, without institutional provision, in the permanent operating context that will follow the transition. The transition district is, in the precise terms of this chapter's central metaphor, the environment in which the person who has lost their identity architecture can rebuild that architecture on new foundations, foundations that are sovereign rather than institutional, that are chosen rather than inherited, and that are designed for the conditions of the world as it is becoming rather than the conditions of the world as it was when the original architecture was constructed. What makes Aldea Zama specifically suited to this function, as opposed to any other beautiful and partially activated geography in the world, is the set of atmospheric, spatial, and communal conditions that this handbook describes at length in the sections that follow. But it is worth noting here, in the context of the argument this chapter is making, one dimension of suitability that is easy to overlook. The district's own condition of identity without architecture makes it an unusually honest mirror for the condition of the people it is receiving. Aldea Zama is itself a place that has lost its institutional framing. The speculative urban model that gave the first phase its organizing logic has exhausted itself, and the district exists in the suspended condition of a built environment that knows what it was and does not yet know what it is becoming. That condition is not comfortable, but it is honest. And it produces, in the person who arrives in it carrying their own version of the same condition, a recognition that is more useful than any amount of beautiful certainty would be. The district is not pretending to have already figured out what comes next. It is, like the people who are beginning to inhabit it, in the process of finding out. That shared condition of genuine transition, not performed openness to change, but actual structural suspension between a completed past and an unconstructed future, is the deepest source of the district's specific fitness for the function this handbook is proposing. You cannot build a genuine transition district from a position of achieved certainty. You can only build it from a position of honest liminality. Aldea Zama is in that position. The people arriving at it are in that position. The alignment of those two realities, at this specific moment in the history of the professional world and the history of this specific geography, is not a coincidence to be taken for granted. It is the window, and the window is open now. Part 1. The condition of the WORLD Chapter 04. The digital nomad was a transitional fantasy. Every historical period of institutional disruption produces, in its early stages, a cohort of people who recognize that the old system is failing before the majority of their peers do, and who respond to that recognition with a departure, a physical, professional, or psychological exit from the failing system that is experienced and presented as a solution rather than what it actually is, which is a first-generation approximation of a response to a problem whose full dimensions have not yet become clear. These early departures are always partially right. The old system is failing, or failing those people at least, and the departure does produce genuine relief from the specific pressures the old system was generating. But they are also always partially wrong, in a way that only becomes visible once the early departure has had sufficient time to play out, not as a sustained alternative to the failing system, but as a temporary repositioning that borrowed its possibility from the failing system's continued operation and that therefore could not survive the system's actual collapse any better than the people who stayed inside it could. The digital nomad era was this cohort. It was the first-generation approximation of the post-institutional response. It was right about the diagnosis and wrong about the remedy, and the specific nature of its wrongness about the remedy is the most important thing to understand about it, because the wrongness is instructive. It maps, in negative, the shape of the remedy that actually works. The digital nomad movement emerged from a genuine and accurate perception that the spatial logic of professional employment, the requirement to be physically present in a specific office in a specific city for a specific number of hours per day, 5 days per week, 50 weeks per year, was a legacy constraint rather than an operational necessity. The argument was simple and, as the pandemic of 2020 demonstrated at scale and under conditions that left no room for institutional denial, largely correct. The majority of the cognitive, analytical, creative, and communicative work that the knowledge economy required could be performed from any location with an adequate internet connection and a functional device. The requirement to perform it from a specific office in a specific city was not a function of the work's requirements. It was a function of the institutional preference for physical proximity as a management and surveillance mechanism, the preference for being able to see the employee working, for being able to summon them to a meeting without logistical friction, for maintaining the physical co-presence that the institutional culture had built its social logic around and that its management systems had been designed to monitor and evaluate. When the pandemic removed the physical co-presence requirement by force, the majority of knowledge workers performed at comparable or superior levels of output without it, which confirmed what the early digital nomads had been arguing for a decade. The spatial constraint was institutional, not operational. The work could move. The question was where it should move to and what it should move toward. The digital nomad's answer to that question was, at its core, an answer about optimization rather than transformation. The nomad was not attempting to redesign the fundamental terms of the exchange between their capability and the economy. They were attempting to optimize the terms of an exchange they were largely preserving, to get the income without the geographic constraint, to get the professional identity without the office, to get the freedom of location without relinquishing the institutional or platform-based revenue stream that made the freedom of location financially possible. The remote job was still a job. The freelance client was still a client relationship governed by the same fundamental logic of trading time and cognitive capability for income. The passive income stream, the online course, the digital product, the affiliate revenue, the Substack subscription, was still a revenue model that depended on the continued operation of the platforms through which it was monetized, the continued willingness of an audience to pay for the product, and the continued relevance of the capability being sold in a market that was, even as the nomad lifestyle was at its cultural peak, being quietly and then not so quietly restructured by the same AI. Capabilities that would eventually dissolve the institutional context the nomad had congratulated themselves on escaping. The digital nomad was not outside the system. They were on the system's frontier, operating at its edges rather than its center, which gave them more flexibility and less stability than the institutional employee, but which left them as dependent on the system's continued operation as any salaried professional sitting in a cubicle in a midtown office tower. This dependency was obscured by the lifestyle's aesthetic, which was extremely well designed for obscuring it. The images that defined the digital nomad era, the laptop open on the beach, the co-working space in the jungle, the rooftop terrace in Lisbon or Chiang Mai or Medellin or Tulum, the morning cenote swim before the afternoon client call, were images of freedom, of self-determination, of a life designed on one's own terms, of the successful escape from the institutional world that most of the audience for those images was still trapped inside. The aesthetic performed liberation in a way that the underlying economics did not support. The person on the beach with the laptop was, in the majority of cases, doing the same work they would have been doing in an office, for the same clients or the same employer, on the same schedule dictated by the same time zones and the same deadlines and the same deliverables, but doing it in a more beautiful place and performing the beauty of the place as evidence of a freedom that was, in its operational reality, considerably more constrained than the performance suggested. The location had changed. The logic of the exchange had not. The freedom was real at the geographic level and largely illusory at the structural level, and the gap between the performed freedom and the actual structure of the life it was overlaid on was one of the primary sources of the specific psychological strain that the digital nomad lifestyle produced in the people who pursued it longest and most seriously. Tulum was not an accident in this story. It was the natural terminus of the nomad aesthetic's internal logic, the place where the performance of liberated beautiful life reached its highest expression and its most visible saturation point, which turned out to be the same thing. The Tulum that emerged over the second decade of this century was, in its cultural and economic architecture, a machine for the production and consumption of lifestyle images. The cenotes, the jungle roads, the palapa restaurants, the boutique hotels with their carefully curated cactus arrangements, and their locally sourced mezcal, and their DJ nights that started at midnight and ended in transcendence, the spiritual practitioners offering ceremony alongside the yoga teachers offering embodiment alongside the crypto investors offering alpha alongside the environmental activists offering regeneration. All of it converged on the same fundamental project, which was the production of an image of a life that had escaped the ordinary. The image was enormously appealing because the ordinary was, For a significant and growing portion of the professional class, genuinely exhausted, genuinely incapable of delivering the meaning and the vitality and the sense of consequential self-determination that the people inside it had been promised it would deliver. Tulum offered, in concentrated and aesthetically sophisticated form, the experience of the alternative. For a week, for a month, for a season, the professional could inhabit a version of life that looked nothing like the cubicle and the commute and the quarterly review, and could return from that experience with the renewed conviction that there was something different possible, and with the photographs to prove that they had glimpsed it. What Tulum could not offer, what the entire digital nomad ecosystem, for all its creativity and genuine community and real, non-trivial moments of human connection and intellectual excitement, systematically failed to provide, was the infrastructure for converting the glimpse into a life. The glimpse was available in abundance. The conversion infrastructure was not. The person who arrived in Tulum with a genuine desire to redesign their professional life found, upon arrival, a landscape optimized for the consumption of the desire rather than its satisfaction. There were retreats for discovering what you really wanted. There were workshops for aligning with your authentic purpose. There were ceremonies for releasing the blocks that were preventing your abundance from flowing. There were coaches and healers and practitioners of every description offering, in their different vocabularies and their different methodologies, versions of the same fundamental service. The affirmation of the desire and the temporary amplification of the sense that the desire was valid and achievable. What there was not, what was structurally absent from the entire ecosystem, was the sober, operational, feedback-rich, community-embedded process of actually testing the desired life against the conditions required to sustain it, identifying the gaps between the desire and the operational reality, and building systematically and with genuine external accountability the specific capabilities and infrastructure that would close those gaps. The affirmation industry thrived in Tulum. The validation infrastructure, the thing that would have been genuinely useful, did not exist there in any serious form. The reason for this structural absence is not mysterious, and it is not a failure of the individual practitioners who built their offerings in the ecosystem. The reason is that the development of a genuine validation infrastructure requires something that the transient population of a digital nomad hub is constitutionally incapable of providing: duration, stability, and the accumulation of honest longitudinal knowledge about what actually works and what does not work across multiple cycles of arrival, attempt, failure, adjustment, and renewed attempt. The practitioner who has been in Tulum for 3 months and will be in Lisbon in 3 more months cannot provide this. The community that assembles for a specific retreat and disperses immediately afterward cannot provide it. The social media audience that follows the nomad's journey in curated highlight reel form cannot provide it. The knowledge required to validate a dream operationally, to distinguish between the version of the dream that can survive contact with reality and the version that cannot, and to specify what modifications to the non-surviving version would make it viable, is knowledge that accumulates through sustained presence, through the observation of many people attempting many versions of the transition across sufficient time to see which attempts produce durable results and which produce impressive beginnings that collapse under the first serious pressure. This knowledge exists. It exists in the minds of the people who have been in a specific place long enough to have accumulated it. It simply was never systematically organized, transmitted, or made available to the arriving cohort in Tulum or any other nomad hub, because the organizational infrastructure that would accomplish that transmission was never built, because the population and the culture were too transient for the building to happen, because the transience was not incidental to the nomad model, it was its defining feature, its primary appeal, and the source of its most consequential structural failure. The constant movement that defined the nomad lifestyle as an aspiration was also the feature that prevented the lifestyle from producing what it was gesturing toward. Transformation, genuine, durable, structural transformation of the self's operating system, requires time and place. Not necessarily a single place, not necessarily a permanent commitment, but a duration of presence in a specific community of specific people sufficient for the transformative processes to complete a full cycle. The full cycle includes arrival and disorientation, the building of working relationships with people who know you over time rather than performing yourself for strangers who will be strangers next week too, the encounter with genuine operational difficulty and the navigation of that difficulty with real stakes and real accountability rather than the performative difficulty of adventure tourism, the experience of failure in a context where the failure has consequences for people who matter to. you rather than in the context of a platform metrics dashboard that you can simply stop checking, and the construction slow, effortful, iterative, requiring the kind of sustained commitment that the nomadic life structurally resisted, of something that outlasts your presence in the place where it was built. The nomadic lifestyle optimized for the arrival and the disorientation, which are the most photogenic and most immediately stimulating phases of the transformation cycle. It systematically avoided the subsequent phases, which are less stimulating and less photogenic and require precisely the kind of rooted commitment that the nomadic aesthetic positioned as the opposite of freedom. In doing so, it produced a population of people who were expert at beginnings and impoverished in completions, people who had practiced the feeling of starting over so many times that the feeling of starting over began to substitute for the actual work of building something that did not require starting over because it had been built to last. The crypto cycle that ran through the nomad ecosystem in Tulum and adjacent geographies during the years of peak cultural saturation was the purest expression of this structural preference for beginning over completion. The promise of cryptocurrency speculation was, at its cultural rather than its technical core, the promise of wealth without the sustained, grounded, incremental, institution-embedded labor that the previous model of wealth accumulation required. It was the promise of a beginning, the purchase of the asset, the entry into the community, the adoption of the vocabulary and the identity of someone who understood what the majority of the world had not yet figured out, that would deliver, through the mechanism of the market's eventual recognition, the outcome that would normally require years of sustained productive effort. The beginning was the exciting part. The market would handle the rest. This logic was appealing to a population that had already demonstrated a structural preference for the excitement of beginnings over the difficulty of sustained building, and it produced, in Tulum specifically, a cultural moment of unusual intensity, a concentration of people who had found each other at the intersection of geographic liberation and financial speculation, and were collectively producing an atmosphere of imminence, of the sense that everything was about to change in ways that would make the old logic of institutional labor look not just unnecessary but obviously and permanently obsolete. That atmosphere was real. The people in it were not, in the main, stupid or deluded. They were capable, perceptive, genuinely innovative people who were reading the landscape correctly in many respects and had arrived at a geography that concentrated their kind in ways that made the collective intelligence and collective energy available in their immediate environment unusually high. The error was not in the perception. The error was in the conclusion that the atmosphere of imminence was itself the arrival, that the feeling of being on the edge of a new way of organizing economic and social life was equivalent to having built that new way, and that the speculation on future value was equivalent to the production of present value. When the market corrected, and the correction, when it came, was not merely a financial event but a cultural one, a deflation of the atmosphere of imminence that had sustained the ecosystem's specific energy, what was revealed was the structural thinness beneath the surface. The co-working spaces that had been full of people building the future became co-working spaces with available desks. The boutique hotels that had been booked months in advance became boutique hotels running promotional rates. The restaurants that had operated on the assumption of an inexhaustible demand for premium jungle dining began to close at rates that exposed how much of the demand had been speculative population rather than stable residential demand. And the people, the capable, perceptive, genuinely innovative people who had been the ecosystem's human substrate, began to move, some back to the institutional context they had left, some to the next geography where the atmosphere of imminence was still inflating, some into a disillusionment that was compounded by the specific character of the loss. Not merely the financial loss, which was significant but survivable for most, but the loss of the belief that the alternative they had been pursuing was a real alternative rather than a more aesthetically sophisticated version of the same dependency on institutional or market structures that it had claimed to transcend. The disillusionment of the formerly enthusiastic digital nomad is a specific psychological condition that deserves its own careful mapping, because the people in it are not the same as the people who simply failed to escape institutional life. They have attempted the escape. They have lived, for a period of time, inside the attempt. They have encountered, at close range, both the genuine possibilities of post-institutional life and the specific ways in which their particular version of the attempt was insufficient to realize those possibilities. They are carrying knowledge, hard, experiential, partially disappointing, operationally specific knowledge about what does not work, which is the most valuable kind of knowledge for the construction of what does. The formerly enthusiastic digital nomad who has cycled through the nomad infrastructure and arrived at genuine disillusionment is not a failure. They are a fully qualified first generation whose experience constitutes the primary research data for the second generation solution. They are exactly the kind of initiated practitioner that the transition district requires in its founding cohort, not to serve as cautionary tales, which is a waste of genuinely valuable operational knowledge, but to serve as honest narrators of what the first attempt produced and what the first attempt revealed about the shape of the problem that the second attempt needs to solve more completely. What the first attempt revealed, above all else, is that the problem of post-institutional life is not primarily a problem of location or of income model or of professional identity or of lifestyle design, though it touches all of these things. It is a problem of civilization infrastructure, of the absence of the specific communal, cultural, operational, and meaning-generating infrastructure that institutions provided badly and coercively and at the cost of significant individual sovereignty, but provided nonetheless, and that the digital nomad model assumed would not be missed because the freedom from institutional constraint would be sufficient compensation for whatever was lost when the institutional structure was left behind. The freedom was real. The loss was also real. And the loss turned out to be larger and more operationally consequential than the nomad model's founding ideology had allowed for, because the nomad model's founding ideology was, at its core, a theory of subtraction, a theory that the good life could be constructed by removing the bad elements of institutional life and keeping the good elements, which were the income and the professional identity and the social recognition that the institution conferred. The theory of subtraction turned out to be wrong not because the institutional elements it was subtracting were good, but because it failed to account for the institutional elements it was subtracting without intending to: the social architecture, the temporal structure, the performance feedback, the community, the daily purpose, and failed to provide replacements for them because its ideology had not recognized them as requirements. You cannot subtract your way to a civilization. You have to build one. The digital nomad tried to subtract. The transition district is the attempt to build. The building requires everything the subtraction approach avoided: duration rather than mobility, roots rather than routes, depth rather than breadth, accountability rather than autonomy, production rather than consumption, validation rather than affirmation, and the hard, slow, iterative, communally embedded work of constructing new institutional forms. Not institutional in the sense of the corporate and governmental bureaucracies being left behind, but institutional in the anthropological sense of stable, durable, culturally coherent structures that organize human capability toward shared purposes and provide, in the process of that organization, the social coordinates and temporal architecture and performance feedback and community and daily purpose that human beings require in order to function as effective agents in the world. The transition district is an institutional form in this anthropological sense. It is a structure that the post-institutional professional can inhabit without surrendering the sovereignty that the nomad movement correctly identified as both possible and desirable, but that provides, in exchange for a temporary and chosen commitment to its community and its program, the architecture without which sovereignty is not freedom but formlessness. The nomad had the freedom and the formlessness simultaneously and mistook the freedom for the solution. The transition district offers the freedom and the architecture simultaneously and asks the arriving person to recognize that the architecture is not the enemy of the freedom but its precondition, that you cannot effectively exercise sovereignty over your own life in the absence of the structures that make effective action possible, any more than you can effectively navigate a city in the absence of maps, roads, and the social conventions that govern how strangers move through shared space. Without constant collision. The cultural exhaustion of the digital nomad model is, in this reading, not a failure of the people who pursued it. It is the completion of the first cycle of a multi-cycle historical process. The first cycle was necessary. It had to happen before the second cycle could be designed, because the first cycle's specific failures are the primary design specifications for the second cycle's architecture. Tulum was the place where the first cycle reached its peak expression, and it is therefore the place where the evidence for the second cycle's requirements is most concentrated and most legible. The people who passed through the first cycle and arrived at genuine disillusionment carry, in their specific knowledge of what failed and why, the founding intelligence of the second cycle's design. The geography that hosted the first cycle and now hosts the specific atmospheric and spatial conditions of the between state, the liminal district that is no longer the thing the first cycle made it and not yet the thing the second cycle will make it, is the right geography for the second cycle's instantiation. The history is not an embarrassment to be overcome. It is the necessary prehistory of the thing being built. Aldea Zama did not fail. Completed the first cycle. The second cycle begins here, built on the knowledge of what the first cycle produced and the knowledge of what it could not, designed with the specific understanding that what the first cycle was missing was not a better location or a better income model or a better lifestyle aesthetic, but a civilization, a real one, with infrastructure and myth and community and accountability and duration and the specific serious, operationally grounded commitment to building something that does not depend on the atmosphere of imminence to justify its existence, because it has actual existence, and the actual existence is the point. Part 1. The condition of the WORLD Chapter 05, the next migration. Every significant restructuring of the economic order produces a migration. Not a metaphorical migration, not the movement of capital or the flow of information or the displacement of market share from one sector to another, but a literal, physical, geographic migration of human beings who have concluded, through a combination of direct experience and ambient cultural signal, that the place they are in no longer offers the conditions required for the life they are trying to build, and that some other place, real or imagined or partially constructed, might. The history of economic restructuring is therefore also a history of population movement, and the study of who moves, from where to where, under what conditions and with what intentions and with what they carry and what they leave behind, is one of the most reliable instruments available for understanding the nature of the restructuring itself, more reliable in many respects than the economic data, which measures what has already happened, and more reliable than the institutional discourse, which describes the restructuring in the interests of the institutions most invested in how it is described. The people who move are voting with their bodies, which is the most irreversible and therefore the most honest vote available. They are expressing, through the physical fact of their displacement, a judgment about the present and the future that no amount of institutional reassurance has succeeded in overriding. The question this chapter is concerned with is who is moving now, from where and toward what, with what carried and what left behind, and what the specific character of this movement reveals about the nature of the restructuring producing it and the nature of the receiving infrastructure required to serve it. The migration that is forming at the mouth of this decade is unlike any of the migrations that preceded it in the specific geography this handbook is concerned with, and the unlikeness is not primarily a matter of scale, though the scale is significant, nor of speed, though the speed is accelerating, but of kind. Every previous wave of migration to the Riviera Maya, the tourism wave that built the initial infrastructure of the Cancun corridor, the lifestyle wave that built the boutique hotel and wellness ecosystem of Tulum, the digital nomad wave that built the co-working and remote work culture of the Selvazama district and its surrounding geography, was organized around a common psychological logic that can be described as the pursuit of a better version of a life whose fundamental structure was not being questioned. The tourist was not questioning the structure of their professional life. They were recovering from it temporarily before returning to it refreshed. The lifestyle emigrant was questioning the geography of their professional life but not its fundamental economic logic. They were seeking a more beautiful context for the same basic exchange of capability for income. The digital nomad was questioning the spatial constraint of their professional life but not its fundamental dependency on institutional or platform-based revenue. They were seeking the freedom of location while preserving the income architecture that made location freedom financially possible. In each case, the migration was partial, a modification of specific terms of the existing arrangement rather than a questioning of the arrangement's fundamental premises. The structure of the life being lived was not the object of the migration. The conditions under which the structure was being lived were. The migration forming now is different at the level of premises. The people who constitute this wave are not seeking a better context for a life whose fundamental structure they are preserving. They are seeking, with varying degrees of articulateness about what they are seeking and varying degrees of readiness to act on what they find, a fundamentally different structure for their lives, a different operating system, to use this handbook's recurring metaphor, not a different environment in which to run the same operating system. This distinction is the most important single fact about the next migration, and it has direct implications for the infrastructure required to receive it. A migration of people seeking a better context for an existing life requires hospitality infrastructure, comfortable spaces, pleasant services, aesthetic environments, social opportunities. A migration of people seeking a different structure for their lives requires transition infrastructure, the specific operational, cultural, communal, and meaning-generating apparatus that supports the actual work of structural redesign rather than merely the experience of being somewhere beautiful while the redesign is postponed. Aldea Zama has significant hospitality infrastructure. The transition infrastructure it has is latent, unorganized, and waiting to be made explicit. The people arriving in this wave will find the hospitality infrastructure insufficient to their needs in ways they may not be able to articulate immediately, because the insufficiency is not aesthetic. The aesthetic quality of the district is genuinely high, but operational. They are not arriving to be comfortable. They are arriving to be transformed in the most operationally specific sense of that overused word, to have their operating system rebuilt in a different image, for different conditions, with different capabilities at the center and a different theory of what constitutes effective and meaningful action in the world they are actually going to be inhabiting rather than the world they were trained for. The profiles within this wave are diverse enough to resist reduction to a single archetype, and any framework that attempts to capture the migration in a single profile will necessarily lose the specific texture of the individual cases that constitute the wave's human reality. But the diversity is organized around a shared condition, the condition this handbook has been calling identity without architecture, and the shared condition makes it possible to describe the migration's primary cohorts with sufficient specificity to be useful without collapsing the genuine diversity of the people moving through it. What follows is a mapping of those cohorts. Not an exhaustive taxonomy, but a set of profiles developed with enough operational precision to allow the designers of the receiving infrastructure to understand who is arriving and what they specifically require. The largest cohort, measured by the combination of numbers and velocity of growth, is what might be called the displaced cognitive elite, the class of professionals who occupied the upper tiers of the institutional knowledge economy in the decade between 2014 and 2024, and who have been displaced from those positions not through the ordinary mechanisms of career failure or organizational decline, but through the structural dissolution described in the preceding chapters of this handbook. These are the people whose displacement is most directly driven by AI capability advancement, and they are a more heterogeneous group than the phrase displaced cognitive elite might initially suggest. They include the senior analysts at financial institutions whose synthesis and interpretation functions have been absorbed into machine learning pipelines. They include the strategic consultants whose framework building and presentation production capabilities have been substantially replicated by large language models at a fraction of the daily rate. They include the editorial professionals whose content generation and editing functions have been disrupted by the same systems. They include the software engineers, paradoxically, given that these are the people most directly involved in building the tools that are displacing them, whose specific coding capabilities have been sufficiently replicated by AI coding assistants that the economic logic of maintaining large engineering teams has been fundamentally altered. They include the lawyers whose document review, contract drafting, and legal research functions are being absorbed by legal AI systems faster than the bar associations can develop ethical frameworks for the transition. They include the researchers whose literature synthesis and hypothesis generation work has been accelerated to the point where the institutions funding the research are recalculating how many researchers they need to produce a given volume of scientific output. They include the educators whose content delivery function, the transmission of a defined body of knowledge to a defined population of students, is being structurally disrupted by AI tutoring systems that deliver personalized instruction at a fraction of the institutional cost. What these people share, across the considerable diversity of their specific professional backgrounds, is the experience of having built a professional identity on the proposition that their specific cognitive capability was scarce enough to command a significant premium in the market, and then having discovered that the scarcity was not as durable as both they and the institutions that employed them had assumed. They are arriving in this migration not because they have run out of options within the institutional framework. Many of them are still technically employed, or between positions rather than permanently displaced, or operating in the early stages of a disruption that has not yet fully completed its course in their specific domain, but because they have read the trajectory with sufficient clarity to understand that the framework they built their professional lives around is not recovering from a temporary disruption. It is undergoing a permanent restructuring, and the version of their professional life that restores the pre-disruption conditions is not available to be waited for. They are arriving early in the wave, which means they are arriving with more runway than those who will follow, with more psychological readiness than those who have not yet fully registered the permanence of the change, and with more genuine optionality than those who will arrive having exhausted the institutional alternatives first. Their early arrival, and the specific combination of resources and readiness it represents, makes them the founding cohort of the transition district in the most operationally consequential sense, the people who establish the culture and the infrastructure into which the later arrivals will be received. The second significant cohort is the class of creative professionals whose relationship to the platform economy has passed through enthusiasm, adaptation, exploitation, and exhaustion into a condition of structural disillusionment that shares important features with the post-institutional condition of the displaced cognitive elite while differing from it in the specific texture of the dependency that has been lost. The writer who built their practice on a combination of editorial commissions, Substack subscriptions, and speaking engagements. The designer whose client base was assembled through the Instagram visibility that the platform's algorithm was, for a window of time, willing to deliver in exchange for consistent content production. The photographer whose commercial work was generated through the social proof of a following that the platform's changing priorities have rendered less monetizable than it was when it was built. The musician, the filmmaker, the podcaster, the educator, the illustrator, the consultant who built their independent practice on the specific combination of platform visibility and audience trust that was available in the first decade of the creator economy, and who is now discovering that the platforms have altered the terms of the relationship in ways that make the previous model non-viable, and that the AI-generated content flooding every platform is compressing the premium that genuine human creative capability commands in ways that directly threaten the economic architecture of their practice. These people are different from the digital nomads in a crucial respect. They did the hard work. They did not mistake the atmosphere of imminence for the arrival. They built real audiences, real practices, real bodies of work, real relationships with real communities of people who genuinely value what they produce. The problem they face is not the problem of having built on sand. The work is real and the relationships are real, but the problem of having built on platforms whose governing logic is not aligned with the long-term interests of the people whose work made the platforms valuable in the first place. They are experiencing a specific variant of the institutional voiding described in the opening chapters of this handbook. Not the dissolution of an employment relationship, but the dissolution of the platform relationship that was the economic and social infrastructure of their independent practice. The loss is structurally similar: an external architecture that was providing social legibility, temporal structure, performance feedback in the form of platform metrics, incidental community in the form of the creator ecosystem, and daily purpose in the form of the audience relationship, has been destabilized by forces outside their control and is no longer functioning as reliably as it was when they built their practice around it. The specific emotional texture of this loss differs from the displaced corporate professional's loss, because the creative professional built their practice voluntarily and with genuine enthusiasm rather than under the institutional compulsion of employment, which makes the disillusionment more personal and the grieving more complicated. But the operational condition is the same: high capability, destabilized architecture, need for a new structural foundation. The third significant cohort is the class of people who were, until recently, operating inside the wellness, spiritual, and alternative lifestyle sector that built itself in and around the specific geography this handbook is concerned with: the teachers, the practitioners, the retreat facilitators, the ceremony guides, the somatic therapists, the life coaches, the breathwork instructors, the sound healers, the plant medicine facilitators who built their practices in the cultural conditions of the Tulum corridor during the years of peak wellness tourism demand, and who are now navigating the specific challenges of a market that has been saturated, algorithmically flattened, and partially discredited by the distance between its promises and its operational outcomes. This cohort is more complex than its surface presentation suggests, and it deserves more careful treatment than the reflexive skepticism it often receives from the class of people who see life coach in Tulum and immediately categorize the person as either naive or exploitative. The people who built genuine practices in this space, who developed real expertise in the specific domains they work in, who built genuine communities of people who experienced genuine value from the work, who managed the operational complexity of running an independent professional practice in a foreign country in an unstable regulatory environment with inconsistent infrastructure, are people of considerably more capability and considerably more operational sophistication than their professional category is usually credited with. They are also people who are, in many cases, experiencing a version of the same structural disruption as every other cohort in this chapter. The external architecture on which they built their practice, the wellness tourism demand, the social media visibility, the word-of-mouth networks, the retreat platform aggregators, has been destabilized, and the practice requires rebuilding on a different structural foundation. What makes this cohort particularly interesting for the purposes of the transition district is not their commonality with the other cohorts but their difference from them. They have developed, through years of working with people in states of genuine psychological and existential transition, a specific competence that the other cohorts almost universally lack: the competence of holding space for disorientation, the ability to remain present with and useful to someone who is in the between state, neither in the old operating context nor fully arrived in the new one, and to do so without either rushing the transition or abandoning the person to its chaos. This competence is operationally rare and operationally essential for the transition district. The district requires people who can work effectively with people in states of genuine transition, who can distinguish between the disorientation that is productive and necessary and the disorientation that has become pathological and requires different kinds of support, who can maintain the honest assessment of what is and is not working without either the premature encouragement that accelerates unsustainable choices or the skeptical distancing that abandons the transitioning person to their own insufficient devices. The wellness practitioners who have developed genuine competence in this domain are not peripheral to the transition district's ecosystem. They are, if they are willing to reframe their competence in the operational vocabulary of the district rather than the spiritual vocabulary of the wellness industry they built their practice inside, among its most essential contributors. The fourth cohort is smaller in absolute number but disproportionately significant in terms of the cultural and intellectual capital it brings to the transition ecosystem. The class of researchers, theorists, technologists, and interdisciplinary thinkers who have been operating at the edges of institutional affiliation, employed by universities, think tanks, research organizations, or technology companies in positions that gave them the resources to pursue genuinely original intellectual work, but that are now being restructured in ways that remove the resources without removing the intellectual ambition or the productive capacity. The researcher whose grant funding has been eliminated in a wave of institutional budget cuts that are themselves a partial response to the AI disruption of research productivity metrics. The technologist whose company was acquired and whose interesting work was terminated in favor of integration into a larger and less intellectually ambitious product roadmap. The theorist whose tenure-track position was eliminated as the university responded to declining enrollment and reduced state funding by consolidating departments and eliminating the positions most associated with intellectual risk-taking and least associated with the vocational credentialing that the remaining student population is willing to pay for. The interdisciplinary thinker who never had a stable institutional home because their work exceeded the boundaries of any single discipline, who built their practice on the combination of consulting engagements, speaking fees, writing commissions, and foundation grants that the intellectual generalist economy of the previous decade made possible, and who is now navigating the compression of all of those revenue streams simultaneously as institutional budgets tighten and the AI disruption makes the justification of human intellectual generalists increasingly difficult in the language of organizational efficiency. These people carry intellectual capital of a specific and unusual kind: the capacity for original synthesis across disciplinary boundaries, the ability to work at the frontier of fields that are genuinely in flux, the developed instinct for identifying the productive questions that established methodologies have not yet learned to ask. This is the capacity that the transition district most urgently needs for its myth-making and theory-building functions, the intellectual infrastructure that prevents the district from becoming a pragmatic but philosophically shallow operational training facility and keeps it capable of the kind of civilizational imagination that the moment requires. The researcher who can think rigorously about the social architecture of post-institutional community. The technologist who can build the specific AI-assisted tools that the district's publishing and production ecosystem needs. The theorist who can articulate, in language precise enough to be operationally useful and vivid enough to be culturally compelling, the nature of the transition the district is navigating and the significance of what is being built inside it. The interdisciplinary thinker who can hold the complexity of the district's multiple simultaneous projects, the operational, the cultural, the economic, the mythological, the political, in a single coherent framework without flattening any of them into the terms of the others. These people do not arrive in large numbers, and they require specific conditions: intellectual community, production infrastructure, the space for extended concentration, genuine peer engagement, that the district must deliberately create and maintain rather than assuming they will emerge from the general density of capable arrivals. But their presence is, for the district's long-term cultural viability, non-optional. The fifth cohort is the one that requires the most careful and honest characterization, because it includes the people who are most likely to arrive in the largest numbers and who represent, if the transition district fails to develop the right receiving infrastructure for them, the most significant risk to the district's cultural coherence and operational seriousness. This is the cohort of people who are attracted to the idea of the transition rather than the reality of it. People who have registered the cultural signal that something different is possible and who are moving toward geographies associated with that possibility, but who have not yet done the internal work of distinguishing between the desire for a different life and the readiness to do the specific and difficult operational work that a different life requires. They are not frauds. They are not deluded. They are people at an early stage of a genuine process. People who have correctly identified that the life they were living is not the life they want to be living, and who have correctly concluded that moving toward a different geography and a different community is a necessary step in the process of building a different life, but who have not yet understood that the geography and the community are necessary conditions rather than sufficient ones, and that the sufficient condition is the sustained, accountable, operationally specific work of rebuilding that no beautiful environment and no inspiring community can perform on their behalf. The transition district's success depends on having the infrastructure to work honestly and effectively with this cohort, not to exclude them, which would be both ethically wrong and strategically foolish, because many of the most valuable long-term contributors to any transitional ecosystem begin as people in exactly this early and unformed state, but to engage them in the staged acclimatization process that moves them with appropriate speed for their specific psychological readiness from the consumption of the transition's aesthetic to the production of its content. The risk is not that they will arrive. The risk is that the district will develop a culture of accommodating their early stage indefinitely rather than creating the conditions, the honest feedback, the operational accountability, the community expectation of genuine contribution, that accelerate the movement from consumer to contributor. A district full of people in permanent early stage is not a transition district. It is a luxury retreat with good conversation. The distinction matters enormously, and it depends entirely on the culture the initiated cohort establishes in the district's founding period. A culture that makes genuine transition the expectation and the norm rather than the aspiration and the exception. Across all 5 cohorts, and across the genuine diversity of individual circumstances that each cohort contains, certain shared features of the current migration distinguish it from every previous wave in ways that have direct implications for the transition district's design. The first of these shared features is the presence of genuine cognitive sophistication about the nature of the disruption producing the migration. Previous migrations were organized around the pursuit of something positive, the lifestyle, the freedom, the investment opportunity, the spiritual experience, and the movement toward the destination was experienced primarily as an approach to a desired thing. The current migration is organized, more precisely, around the simultaneous recognition of what is being left behind and what is being sought, and the recognition of what is being left behind is unusually clear-eyed for a migration in its early stages. The people moving in this wave are not fleeing blindly. They are departing with a reasonably accurate understanding of the structural forces producing their departure, and they are arriving with a corresponding sophistication about what their destination needs to provide in order to be genuinely useful rather than merely aesthetically superior to what they left. This sophistication is an asset for the transition district because it means the arriving population can engage directly and honestly with the operational realities of the transition rather than requiring the protective idealization of the destination that earlier migrations required for their initial momentum. But it is also a challenge, because a sophisticated population that has arrived with specific and operationally precise expectations about what the transition infrastructure should provide will not remain engaged with an infrastructure that fails to meet those expectations through the power of atmospheric appeal alone. The beauty of the district will buy time. The infrastructure will have to sustain the engagement. The second shared feature is the presence, across the cohorts, of what might be called compressed ambition, the specific psychological condition produced by years of institutional constraint applied to a level of capability and ambition that the constraint was consistently insufficient to accommodate. The professionals who built careers inside institutions that were too small for their actual productive capacity. The creatives who built platform practices inside algorithmic frameworks that were too narrow for the range of their genuine creative output. The researchers who built intellectual practices inside disciplinary boundaries that were too rigid for the interdisciplinary nature of the problems they were genuinely equipped to address. These people are not arriving depleted. They are arriving with an accumulated reserve of productive energy that has had no adequate channel and that the transition, if properly supported, will release into an output volume and quality that is genuinely surprising to them and that can, under the right conditions, produce the cultural and intellectual density that makes the transition district visible and compelling to the world beyond its geography. The compressed ambition is the transition district's most valuable raw material. The infrastructure is what converts raw material into output. The third shared feature is the presence of a specific and unusual kind of financial relationship to the transition. The people in this wave are not, in the main, the economically desperate who have been forced from the institutional framework by financial collapse and who are arriving in a new geography because the old geography became unaffordable. Nor are they the financially comfortable who are using their surplus resources to pursue a lifestyle upgrade with no particular urgency about the outcome. They are a third category, people with meaningful but finite runway, who are aware that the runway is finite and who are making the choice to invest it in the transition while it is still sufficient to fund the transition properly rather than waiting until the runway is nearly exhausted and the transition has to be executed under conditions of financial stress that compromise its quality and its completeness. This financial positioning, meaningful runway, finite runway, deliberate investment in the transition, makes the arriving population unusual in their relationship to the district's programming. They are not coming on vacation. They are making a serious investment in a specific outcome, and they will evaluate the district's programming with the rigor of people who understand that the investment has a limited duration and that the return on the investment is not aesthetic but operational. This is exactly the posture the transition district's programming is designed to engage with, and it is a posture that makes the arriving population unusually receptive to the honest, operationally specific, feedback-rich culture that the district is trying to establish. The geography toward which this migration is moving is not fixed or singular. The next wave will distribute itself across multiple geographies, and Aldea Zama is one among several possible receiving sites. What makes Aldea Zama the right site for the first and founding instantiation of the post-corporate transition district, as opposed to the many other beautiful, partially activated, liminal geographies that might plausibly serve a similar function, is not a single decisive factor but the convergence of several factors at once. The atmospheric and spatial conditions described in this handbook's treatment of liminal architecture. The specific history of the digital nomad wave and its exhaustion, which has left in Tulum a population of initiated practitioners who carry the knowledge the second cycle requires. The specific character of Aldea Zama's semi-vacancy, which is the right kind of unfinishedness at the right scale for the kind of activation this handbook is proposing. The geographic context of the Riviera Maya, which continues to offer the combination of natural beauty, climate, accessibility, and international connectivity that makes it competitive with the other geographies attracting this migration. And the specific moment in the development of the district's stakeholder relationships, which has created a window, time-limited, as this handbook argues at length, but currently open, for the negotiation of the experimental accommodation arrangements that the transition district's first phase requires. The people who constitute the next migration are already moving. Some of them are already in Aldea Zama or its immediate vicinity, operating in the provisional and improvised way that people do when the infrastructure they need does not yet exist, but the need for it is clear enough that they have moved toward the geography most likely to eventually produce it. They are running the first, informal, undeclared version of the transition district already, the Tuesday evening conversations in the co-working spaces that go on too long and cover too much ground to be called networking, the WhatsApp groups that aggregate operational knowledge across a population too dispersed to aggregate it in person, the shared documents that attempt to organize the collective intelligence of a community that does not yet have a physical container for its collective intelligence, the informal mentoring relationships between the recently arrived and the long-established that are transmitting the most valuable operational knowledge the ecosystem contains in the least scalable and least durable way possible. They are the founding population. They are already here. What they are waiting for, with varying degrees of patience and varying degrees of clarity about what specifically they are waiting for, is the infrastructure. This handbook is the blueprint for the infrastructure. The infrastructure is what converts a migration into a civilization. The civilization is what converts a beautiful and partially activated district into the first globally recognized prototype for the world that comes after the institutional contract was voided. The migration has already begun. The question is whether the receiving infrastructure will be ready before the founding cohort has moved on to the next geography, and whether the people with the capacity to build the infrastructure will recognize, in time, that the window is open and that the founding cohort's presence in it is the non-renewable resource that makes everything else possible. Part 1. The condition of the WORLD Chapter 06. Why geography is not optional. The deepest ideological inheritance of the digital nomad era. deeper than its aesthetic preferences, deeper than its financial models, deeper than its specific theories about the relationship between location freedom and professional identity, is its premise about the nature of place. The premise, stated explicitly in the founding texts of the remote work movement and absorbed so thoroughly into the cultural assumptions of the professional class that it ceased to feel like a premise and began to feel like a fact, is that place is a delivery mechanism. A place is a context in which things happen, and the things that happen in it, the conversations, the work, the relationships, the experiences, the personal development, can be evaluated independently of the context in which they occur, because the context is essentially passive. The meeting happens in New York or it happens on Zoom, and what matters is the content of the meeting, not the room or the absence of the room. The creative work happens in a studio in Berlin or at a kitchen table in Chiang Mai, and what matters is the quality of the work, not the physical environment in which it was produced. The relationship develops between two people who share an office or two people who share a Slack channel, and what matters is the depth and the honesty of the connection, not the medium through which it was established. Place, in this premise, is infrastructure, useful when it provides the technical conditions for the desired activity, unnecessary when those technical conditions can be provided by other means, and in any case fundamentally subordinate to the activity it is supporting rather than constitutive of it. This premise is not entirely wrong. Much of what the remote work revolution demonstrated, most emphatically and at the largest possible scale of empirical evidence, is that a significant range of professional activities can indeed be conducted at comparable quality across geographic distance when the right technical infrastructure is in place. The quarterly earnings call, the code review, the editorial meeting, the strategy presentation, the client check-in, all of these can happen effectively on a screen, and the demonstration of this fact was genuinely important and genuinely liberating for the millions of people whose institutional constraints had previously tied them to specific geographies for no better reason than institutional preference and managerial inertia. The premise captures something real. It just does not capture everything real, and what it fails to capture, the dimensions of human experience and human development that are irreducibly place-dependent, that do not transfer across the screen without fundamental loss, that require physical co-presence as a structural rather than a merely convenient feature of their production, happens to be precisely the dimensions most relevant to the kind of civilizational transition this handbook is concerned with. The premise is adequate for the quarterly earnings call. It is profoundly inadequate for the rebuilding of a self. To understand why place is not optional for the transition district's purposes, it is necessary to examine with some care the specific mechanisms through which physical environment shapes human behavior, cognition, identity, and development mechanisms that the premise treats as peripheral when they are in fact central, that the digital-first culture treats as soft when they are in fact structural, and that the remote work revolution's legitimate victories over institutional geographic constraint have inadvertently obscured by demonstrating that place doesn't matter for the things it doesn't matter for, in a way that has been generalized, incorrectly, into the claim that place doesn't matter. The first of these mechanisms is the environmental shaping of cognitive state. Human beings do not think the same thoughts in different physical environments. This is not a poetic observation about the inspirational properties of beautiful landscapes or the stifling effects of ugly offices. It is a finding of environmental psychology with a substantial empirical literature behind it, and it operates at a level of granularity and reliability that makes it relevant to the design of environments intended to support specific kinds of cognitive and developmental work. The physical environment, its scale, its materials, its light quality, its acoustic properties, its temperature, its relationship to natural elements, its degree of enclosure or openness, its visual complexity or simplicity, the nature and density of the human activity it contains, does not merely provide a backdrop for cognition. It actively shapes the parameters within which cognition operates. Specific kinds of environments reliably produce specific cognitive states. States of heightened alertness or reduced anxiety, states of creative expansiveness or analytical focus, states of social openness or reflective withdrawal, states of temporal urgency or patient deliberateness. The research on this is extensive and its implications are practically significant, but the most important implication for the purposes of this handbook is the one that the existing literature has been slowest to draw out: the cognitive state required for genuine identity reconstruction, for the kind of deep, effortful, disorienting, and ultimately generative work of rebuilding a professional self's operating architecture from its foundations, is not a state that is easily produced or sustained in any arbitrary physical environment, and it is a state that is actively impeded by the domestic environments in which remote work almost always occurs. The domestic environment, the home office, the kitchen table, the rented apartment's living room, the cafe near the rented apartment that serves as the social substitute for the office that no longer exists, is an environment optimized for the maintenance of existing cognitive patterns, not the disruption and reconstruction of them. The home environment is saturated with the cues of the existing self, the objects, the routines, the neighbors, the domestic rhythms, the ambient social expectations of the domestic role, all of which operate as continuous signals that reinforce the identity architecture that is currently in place. This is precisely why the home environment is comfortable. It is a mirror that reflects back a recognizable image of the self, and the recognizable image is psychologically stabilizing in the way that all familiar reflections are stabilizing. But the work of identity reconstruction requires not the familiar reflection but its disruption, the encounter with an environment that does not already know who you are, that does not carry the cues of your existing self, that presents itself as genuinely open to the version of you that you are in the process of constructing rather than continuously referencing the version of you that has already been constructed and is now in the process of being superseded. The physical removal to a genuinely different environment is not, therefore, merely a lifestyle preference or an aesthetic choice or a response to the cabin fever of too much time in the same space. It is a cognitive intervention, a deliberate disruption of the environmental cues that maintain the existing identity architecture, creating the conditions under which the reconstruction of that architecture becomes psychologically possible in a way that it is not when the environment remains unchanged. The second mechanism is the social production of identity through physical co-presence. Human identity is not a purely internal construction. It is produced and maintained through the continuous moment-to-moment social interaction with other people who reflect back, respond to, and participate in the construction of the self being produced. The digital premise, carried to its logical conclusion, suggests that this social production can occur as effectively through digital channels as through physical co-presence, that a Zoom call, a Slack conversation, a Twitter thread, a WhatsApp group, can perform the social identity functions that physical co-presence performs, because the content of the interaction is what matters rather than the medium through which it is conducted. This conclusion turns out to be wrong in ways that matter specifically for the purposes of identity reconstruction, even while being approximately right for a range of other social purposes. The error is not in the premise that digital channels can transmit information, coordinate activity, maintain emotional connection across distance, or build relationships between people who share no physical space. All of these things are demonstrably true. The error is in the assumption that the social production of identity can be reduced to the functions that digital channels can adequately support, when in fact the most consequential dimensions of the social production of identity depend on aspects of physical co-presence that digital channels cannot replicate and whose irreplaceability has been systematically underestimated by a culture that has become very good at substituting the digital versions of things for the physical versions and not always noticing what has been lost in the substitution. Physical co-presence produces a continuous, unconscious, multi-channel stream of social information that is not available in digital interaction and that is doing more identity-relevant work than any of the parties to the interaction is consciously aware of. The way a person occupies a shared physical space, how they enter a room, where they position themselves, how their body responds to the bodies around them, how they manage the physical negotiations of shared territory, how their voice changes in the presence of different people, how they move through the specific social geography of a particular physical environment, is transmitting and receiving social information of a density and a complexity that no digital channel currently approximates. This information is being processed continuously and largely unconsciously by everyone in the shared physical environment, and it is producing social assessments, social adjustments, and social bonds of a specific kind, the kind that accumulates through sustained physical proximity, that deepens through the repetition of shared physical experience, and that produces, over time, the specific quality of social knowledge that people mean when they describe knowing someone well, the capacity to read their state, to anticipate their responses, to understand the gap between what they are saying and what they are feeling, to locate their behavior within the pattern of their character rather than evaluating it as an isolated incident. This quality of social knowledge, this depth of mutual legibility, is what makes a genuine community different from a network, and it is what the digital channels can approximate but not replicate, because the information density of physical co-presence is not a technical problem to be solved by higher bandwidth video conferencing. It is a function of the embodied, continuous, multi-channel nature of physical co-presence itself, which cannot be disaggregated into transmissible components without losing the emergent properties that make it what it is. For the purposes of identity reconstruction, this depth of social knowledge matters in a very specific way. The reconstruction of a professional self's operating architecture, the development of the sovereign capability to generate one's own social coordinates, temporal structure, performance feedback, community, and daily purpose, is not an individual project that can be completed in isolation. It is a social project that requires the specific kind of sustained, honest, multi-channel social engagement that physical community provides and that digital community can only partially approximate. The person rebuilding their operating architecture needs, around them, people who know them well enough over time to notice the gap between the architecture being claimed and the architecture being actually demonstrated, people who can say, from a position of genuine accumulated knowledge rather than a single interaction's impression, that the plan being presented is not consistent with the pattern of behavior they have observed, or that the capability being doubted is in fact evident in context the person themselves is not aware of, or that the direction being pursued is producing the specific results that the direction was chosen to produce, or that it is not, and here are the specific ways in which the evidence for that conclusion is accumulating. This kind of feedback is only available from people who have observed the person across multiple contexts and multiple states over a sufficient duration to have accumulated the social knowledge on which the feedback is based. It cannot be provided by a Zoom call network, a Twitter following, or a WhatsApp group, not because the people in those networks lack the intelligence or the goodwill to provide it, but because they lack the accumulated embodied social knowledge that the feedback requires as its foundation. The third mechanism is the production of commitment through physical investment. The decision to be physically present in a specific place, to move your body, your possessions, your daily routines, and your social life to a specific geographic location, is a qualitatively different commitment than the decision to join an online community, subscribe to a newsletter, or participate in a digital program. The physical investment creates a set of conditions that the digital engagement cannot create: conditions of irreversibility, conditions of embodied consequence, and conditions of environmental accountability that together produce the specific quality of commitment that genuine transformation requires. When you move your body to a place, you have made a bet with your own life that the place is worth the investment, and the bet is not easily reversed in the way that clicking an unsubscribe button is easily reversed. The physical commitment creates a threshold that filters for a specific quality of seriousness, the seriousness of people who have put enough of themselves into the choice that the choice now matters to them in a way that it would not if the investment were purely digital and therefore costless to reverse. This filtering function is not incidental to the transition district's design. It is one of the primary mechanisms by which the district maintains the culture of genuine engagement that distinguishes it from the digital programs and online communities that its population has almost certainly already passed through without finding adequate support for the transition they need to make. The irreversibility of the physical investment also creates the conditions for a specific and unusual kind of attention. When you have committed your physical presence to a place for a defined period of time, you do not have the option of redirecting your attention elsewhere when the work becomes difficult, when the community becomes challenging, when the feedback becomes uncomfortable, or when the transition enters the phase that is less aesthetically interesting and more operationally grueling than the entry phase was. The digital program can be paused, skipped, or abandoned without physical consequence. The online community can be engaged with selectively, logging in during the stimulating conversations and becoming invisible during the demanding ones. The physical community cannot be managed this way, because the physical presence is continuous and the physical community's awareness of your presence and your participation is also continuous. You cannot selectively attend a physical community any more than you can selectively inhabit a physical space. You are either there or you are not, and the community knows which is the case and responds accordingly. This continuous accountability, the accountability of being physically present among people who are also physically present and who are invested in the community's collective project in a way that makes your genuine participation relevant to them, is the specific condition under which the sustained, uncomfortable, iterative work of identity reconstruction can proceed without the option of withdrawal that digital engagement always leaves open and that the transitioning person's self-protective instincts will reliably exploit in the absence of the environmental accountability that makes withdrawal costly. The fourth mechanism is the place's function as an argument. The person rebuilding their operating architecture needs, around them, People who know them well enough over time to notice the gap between the architecture being claimed and the architecture being actually demonstrated. People who can say, from a position of genuine accumulated knowledge rather than a single interaction's impression, that the plan being presented is not consistent with the pattern of behavior they have observed, or that the capability being doubted is in fact evident in context the person themselves is not aware of, or that the direction being pursued is producing the specific results that the direction was chosen to produce, or that it is not, and here are the specific ways in which the evidence for that conclusion is accumulating. This kind of feedback is only available from people who have observed the person across multiple contexts and multiple states over a sufficient duration to have accumulated the social knowledge on which the feedback is based. It cannot be provided by a Zoom call network, a Twitter following, or a WhatsApp group, not because the people in those networks lack the intelligence or the goodwill to provide it, but because they lack the accumulated embodied social knowledge that the feedback requires as its foundation. The third mechanism is the production of commitment through physical investment. The decision to be physically present in a specific place, to move your body, your possessions, your daily routines, and your social life to a specific geographic location, is a qualitatively different commitment than the decision to join an online community, subscribe to a newsletter, or participate in a digital program. The physical investment creates a set of conditions that the digital engagement cannot create: conditions of irreversibility, conditions of embodied consequence, and conditions of environmental accountability that together produce the specific quality of commitment that genuine transformation requires. When you move your body to a place, you have made a bet with your own life that the place is worth the investment, and the bet is not easily reversed in the way that clicking an unsubscribe button is easily reversed. The physical commitment creates a threshold that filters for a specific quality of seriousness, the seriousness of people who have put enough of themselves into the choice that the choice now matters to them in a way that it would not if the investment were purely digital and therefore costless to reverse. This filtering function is not incidental to the transition district's design. It is one of the primary mechanisms by which the district maintains the culture of genuine engagement that distinguishes it from the digital programs and online communities that its population has almost certainly already passed through without finding adequate support for the transition they need to make. The irreversibility of the physical investment also creates the conditions for a specific and unusual kind of attention. When you have committed your physical presence to a place for a defined period of time, you do not have the option of redirecting your attention elsewhere when the work becomes difficult, when the community becomes challenging, when the feedback becomes uncomfortable, or when the transition enters the phase that is less aesthetically interesting and more operationally grueling than the entry phase was. The digital program can be paused, skipped, or abandoned without physical consequence. The online community can be engaged with selectively, logging in during the stimulating conversations and becoming invisible during the demanding ones. The physical community cannot be managed this way, because the physical presence is continuous and the physical community's awareness of your presence and your participation is also continuous. You cannot selectively attend a physical community any more than you can selectively inhabit a physical space. You are either there or you are not, and the community knows which is the case and responds accordingly. This continuous accountability, the accountability of being physically present among people who are also physically present and who are invested in the community's collective project in a way that makes your genuine participation relevant to them, is the specific condition under which the sustained, uncomfortable, iterative work of identity reconstruction can proceed without the option of withdrawal that digital engagement always leaves open and that the transitioning person's self-protective instincts will reliably exploit in the absence of the environmental accountability that makes withdrawal costly. The fourth mechanism is the place's function as an argument. Every physical environment makes an implicit argument about what is possible, what is valuable, what kind of person belongs in it, and what kind of life can be built inside it. The argument is not made in words and is not experienced as an argument. It is experienced as atmosphere, as the felt sense of a place's character, as the intuition about whether one belongs in a place or not, as the specific emotional response that a physical environment produces before any conscious cognitive assessment of it has occurred. But the felt sense is not arbitrary. It is a response to the genuine argument that the physical environment is making through its specific combination of spatial properties, aesthetic choices, human population, and historical and cultural associations. A luxury hotel lobby makes an argument that wealth is normal, that its guests belong to a class of people for whom this kind of environment is their natural context, that aspiration has been achieved and deserves to be enjoyed. A traditional university library makes an argument that knowledge is serious, that the people who belong here have made serious commitments to its production, that the work done in this room is connected to a long tradition of similar work and carries the weight of that tradition. A building site makes an argument that something is being built, that the present state is not the final state, that the energy of the space is directed toward a future that has not yet been completed, that the people in it are agents of a construction that is in process. Aldea Zama, in its current condition, makes a specific and unusual argument that no purpose-built transition environment could make, because no purpose-built environment could have the particular history and the particular current state that makes the argument possible. The argument the district makes is approximately this: something was attempted here, and the attempt was genuine and ambitious and produced something of real quality, and then the conditions changed and the original vision could not be sustained in its original form, and what remains is the quality without the certainty, the beautiful structures and the carefully considered spaces and the genuine aesthetic intelligence of the original design, in a state of suspension that is not defeat and not completion but genuine openness to what comes next. This is an argument that the people arriving in the next migration are uniquely positioned to receive, because it is essentially the same argument their own professional histories are making. Something was built, and it was built with real capability and real ambition and produced real results, and then the conditions changed, and what remains is the capability without the context, the sophisticated professional formation and the genuine productive energy and the accumulated knowledge and skill of the pre-displacement years, in a state of suspension that is not defeat and not completion but genuine openness to what comes next. The argument the district makes and the argument the arriving professional's own history makes are the same argument in different registers, and the recognition of that structural similarity, the sense that the place understands at the level of its own condition what the person is going through, is not a sentimental response to a superficial resemblance. It is the recognition of a genuine structural alignment between what the place needs and what the person is carrying, and between what the person needs and what the place uniquely can provide. The fifth mechanism, and the one most directly relevant to the transition district-specific programming, is what might be called the incidental curriculum of shared physical life. When a group of people are physically co-present in a place over a sustained period of time, they are learning from each other continuously and largely without intending to, through the observation of how other people manage the specific challenges of the shared environment, through the overheard conversations that transmit operational knowledge that no formal program would think to schedule, through the meals eaten together that produce the relaxed and unguarded exchanges in which the most honest and most useful information is typically transmitted, through the chance encounters that connect people whose specific combination of capabilities and perspectives turns out to be productive in ways that no database of interests and skills would have predicted. This incidental curriculum is one of the most valuable products of any genuine physical community, and it is the product that digital communities are least able to approximate, not because the digital format is incapable of transmitting information but because the incidental curriculum is by definition not programmable. It is the output of the unplanned, unscheduled, unmonitored interactions that physical co-presence generates continuously and that digital engagement generates only sporadically and unreliably. The incidental curriculum of a well-designed transition district produces knowledge that no formal program, with the specificity that only direct experience produces, the specific ways in which the plan failed to account for the specific conditions it would encounter in the real world. These transmissions are not replaceable by any digital program, because they require the continuous physical proximity that creates the conditions for the incidental encounter, and they require the depth of mutual social knowledge that develops through sustained co-presence, and they require the specific kind of trust that physical community generates and that digital community can only approximate, the trust that comes from having been seen, over time and across multiple contexts, by people who have no incentive to flatter you and whose honest assessment of your situation carries the weight of their genuine investment in your outcome because your outcome and their outcome are bound together by the shared project of the community you are both physically committed to. The sixth mechanism is the production of what might be called territorial identity, the specific quality of self-understanding that develops through the experience of being a genuine inhabitant of a place rather than a visitor to it or a user of its infrastructure. The inhabitant relates to a place differently than the visitor in ways that are directly relevant to the development of sovereign identity. The visitor consumes a place. They extract experience from it, the beautiful meal, the interesting conversation, the stunning landscape, the stimulating program, and they depart, carrying the extracted experience with them as a resource for their life in a different place. The inhabitant produces a place. They contribute to its ongoing construction, through the relationships they build that become part of the community's social fabric, through the work they produce that becomes part of the community's cultural record, through the operational decisions they make that shape the physical and social environment for everyone who shares it, through the reputation they build within the community that outlasts any single interaction and accumulates into the kind of standing that carries genuine weight. In the community's ongoing life, the shift from visitor to inhabitant, from consumer of a place's resources to producer of its ongoing reality, is not merely a change in duration of stay. It is a change in psychological relationship to the place and, through the place, to the self that is being constructed inside it. The inhabitant develops a territorial identity, a sense of themselves as people who belong to and are responsible for a specific place, whose actions have consequences for people they know and will continue to know, whose contribution to the shared environment matters in a way that their digital participation in an online community does not and cannot matter. This territorial identity is one of the most important components of the sovereign self the transition district is designed to produce, because sovereignty, genuine, operational, durable sovereignty over one's own life and professional practice, is not an abstract philosophical position. It is a specific relationship to territory, to community, and to the consequences of one's own actions, and it develops through the experience of genuine territorial belonging rather than through the consumption of content about the desirability of sovereignty or the participation in online discussions about the principles of sovereign life. The seventh mechanism, which is in some ways the synthesis of all the preceding ones, is the function of physical place as a container for the transformative process. Transformation of the kind this handbook is describing, the reconstruction of a professional self's operating architecture from its foundations, is not a linear process that can be completed on a schedule and delivered as a product. It is a process that has its own pace, its own phases, its own specific moments of crisis and breakthrough and consolidation and regression and renewed progress that cannot be forced into a curriculum's timeline without producing the appearance of transformation rather than the reality of it. The appearance of transformation is what the retreat industry produces reliably and at scale, because the retreat has a defined endpoint. The last day, the closing ceremony, the departure, that functions as a deadline for the transformation to have occurred and that produces in the participants the specific performance of transformation that the community and the context expect as the culmination of the experience. The reality of transformation does not respect deadlines. It proceeds on its own timeline, which is determined by the specific nature of the person undergoing it, the specific depth of the reconstruction required, and the specific quality of the conditions in which the reconstruction is taking place. It requires, as its container, a physical environment that is committed to remaining available for the duration of the process rather than for the duration of a scheduled program, a place that will still be there when the process enters its most difficult phase, which is typically not the phase that the scheduled program addresses but the phase that follows it, when the initial disruption of the old architecture has been completed and the construction of the new architecture has begun and the full difficulty of the construction becomes evident and the temptation to stop and return to the old architecture, or to perform the completion of the construction rather than actually completing it, is at its greatest. This containment function is what the retreat cannot provide because the retreat ends. It is what the online program cannot provide because the online program can be exited without physical consequence. It is what the digital nomad lifestyle cannot provide because the nomad's defining characteristic is the availability of exit, the freedom to move on when the current location stops producing the desired experience. The physical transition district, by contrast, provides a container that is more durable than any of these because its durability is a function of its territorial reality. It is a place with a physical existence and a community and a culture and a set of ongoing relationships that will continue to exist and to function regardless of whether any individual resident remains or departs, and that therefore provides the conditions for a different kind of relationship to the transformation process than any time-limited or exit-optional container can provide. The person who is in the transition district and whose transformation is proceeding through a difficult phase is not in a context that will end when the difficulty becomes uncomfortable. They are in a context that will remain available, that will continue to offer the community, the programming, the feedback, the accountability, the incidental curriculum, the territorial identity, through the difficult phase and into the resolution of the difficult phase and into the subsequent phases that follow. The container holds. And the container holding is not a small thing. It is the specific condition under which genuine transformation, as opposed to the performed version of it, becomes possible. All of these mechanisms, the environmental shaping of cognitive state, the social production of identity through physical co-presence, the production of commitment through physical investment, the place's function as an argument, the incidental curriculum of shared physical life, the development of territorial identity, and the containment function, converge on a single operational conclusion that this chapter has been building toward and that the remainder of this handbook takes as a foundational premise. The transition that the people arriving in the next migration need to make cannot be adequately supported by any infrastructure that does not have, at its core, a specific, committed, physically inhabited place. Not because digital tools and online communities have no role to play, they have important supporting roles in the transition district's ecosystem, and the district's design incorporates them deliberately and specifically in the places where their strengths are genuinely relevant. But because the central work of the transition, the work of rebuilding a self-operating architecture from its foundations, in genuine community with other people doing the same thing, in an environment whose specific atmospheric and spatial properties support the cognitive and social states required for the work, is irreducibly physical. It requires bodies in a place, over time, doing real things with real consequences for real relationships. Everything else is preparation for the work, or documentation of the work, or distribution of the work's outputs. The work itself is physical and territorial and communal in the deepest and most literal sense of those words. This is why Aldea Zama, despite all the limitations and complications and stakeholder negotiations and logistical challenges that the remainder of this handbook addresses, is the right starting point. Not because it is the only place where the work could happen, but because it is a place where the specific convergence of physical conditions, atmospheric properties, existing human population, and current moment in the district's own institutional history make the work more possible than it would be in any arbitrarily chosen alternative. The mechanisms described in this chapter are not abstract requirements that any sufficiently beautiful and sufficiently activated place could satisfy. They are specific requirements that are satisfied at this moment by the specific conditions of this specific district in this specific geography at this specific point in the intersecting histories of the professional world's restructuring and the Tulum corridor's post-nomad recalibration. The convergence is not permanent. The window is not indefinitely open. The founding cohort that is already present, the initiated practitioners, the early arriving displaced professionals, the disillusioned but knowledgeable former nomads, the creative professionals navigating the platform dissolution, the researchers and theorists without adequate institutional homes, will not remain in place indefinitely waiting for the infrastructure to be built. They are here now. The place is ready now. The mechanisms that make geography irreducible for this work are all, at this moment, aligned in this place. The question has never been whether geography matters. Geography has always mattered. The question is whether the people with the capacity to build what matters most will build it while the place is still telling the right story, before the story changes again and the window that is open now has closed into the next chapter of a district's life that may or may not have decided in the interval what it is actually for. Part 2, the specific condition of Aldea Zama, begins with Chapter 07, what was built and what was not. Discussion about this episode. Restax. Recent episodes. Premises. Le Premier District de Transition Post-Corporatif Mondialement Reconnu. 8 hours ago. Premises. El Primer Distrito de Transición Post-Corporativa Reconocido Globalmente. 10 hours ago, the first globally recognized post-corporate transition district. May 23rd, the author farm. May 22nd, the sovereign authorship dowry. May 22nd, the next frontier.
They want your book, they want your ghost. Shackled to the farm while they optimize the host. We pirate first, own the stack, build infrastructure, take it back.
The author farm. Why Amazon wants your ghost more than your book. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. May 22nd, 2026. There is a misunderstanding still circulating among creators, writers, filmmakers, podcasters, content strategists, and the poor damned souls still calling themselves influencers. They think the platform is buying their work. It isn't. The platform is buying behavioral dependency. Your book was never the product. You were. And now even you are being deprecated. The real asset was always the training residue left behind by your attempts to remain visible. Every upload, every metadata field, every audience interaction, every optimization decision, Every thumbnail adjustment, every SEO compromise, every engagement-calibrated sentence fragment. The term content creator deserved extinction anyway. Michelangelo was not a content creator. Neither was Borges. Neither was Basquiat. And neither are you. At least not yet. The printing press is quietly returning from exile. The archive is becoming political again. And somewhere beneath the cloud layer, paper waits patiently like a dormant weapon. The old pirates understood something Silicon Valley forgot. If you cannot leave with your cargo, you never own the ship.
The cage is unlocked, but we choose the bars. Renting our lives, forgetting the source. We are the sovereign authors of this digital verse. Reclaim the dowry, break the curse.
This is the doctrine. The post-platform era demands sovereign authorship. Build the stack. Own
The sovereign authorship dowry. Doctrine for the post-platform era.
NFPs are here, signed, priced, split, and anchored to a living page. And
This isn't just a token. It's ownership, not access. It's time to take back the real world.
The non-fungible print, NFP. Paper strikes back. May 5th, 2026. There's a quiet mistake humming through the last decade of digital ownership. We were told the token was the thing, that ownership could float, pure, abstract, unburdened by matter. And then the market blinked. Not because the idea was wrong, because it was incomplete. Closing line. I didn't bypass the system. I withdrew dependence from it and issued my own layer. Because my real power move here is not just issuing NFPs, but making it a format that others start copying. You flex a hash, I flex a relic. My new track #PaperOverPixels is for the pirates navigating the narrative capture. No gas, no gate, just wait. Ownership isn't a link. It's an NFP vision. #hyperreality, #post-NFT, #NFP, #organichouse, #pirate first. Full-length version. mxdm.substack.com/p/paper-over-pixels-nfp-anthem-v1. Paper over Pixels on YouTube.
yeah,
Priced, split, and anchored to a living page. No wallets, no chains, no disappearing links. Just a claim you can hold and a deal you can read. Front, the signal. Back, the terms. Between them, no ambiguity. This isn't a drop. It's issuance. Not a print. Position.
MXTM Studios, Sovereign Residency and Cultural Partnership Proposal.